15 years ago, I stood in the pouring rain in Detroit and threw a handful of dirt onto my son Kendrick's casket. Right before they closed the heavy mahogany lid, I slipped his favorite cell phone into the breast pocket of his suit. It was a silly, sentimental gesture. I paid the monthly bill for 5 years just to hear his voicemail greeting until the telecommunications company finally recycled the number. Or so I thought. Last night at exactly 2:14 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The caller ID made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was Kendrick's old number. My hand shook violently as I answered the call. Through a thick storm of static, I heard a voice that belonged to a ghost. "Dad, I do not have much time left." Then came the unmistakable, deafening crack of a gunshot. The line went dead. How does a phone buried under 6 feet of dirt make a call unless it was never buried at all? Before I uncover the truth behind this nightmare, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always finds a way to dig itself out of the grave. I am Leon Carter. I am 75 years old, a retired auto mechanic who spent 30 years breathing in exhaust fumes and grease in the Detroit assembly plants. I sacrificed my own body so my son could have a better life. And Kendrick made good on that sacrifice. He was a genius, a tech prodigy who built software that could change the world. When he died at 28 in what the police called a tragic drunk driving accident, my entire world ended. His massive life insurance policy paid for a sprawling modern mansion in an upscale gated community. And where do I live? I live in the converted tool shed in the backyard. That was the strict arrangement my white daughter-in-law Rebecca insisted upon when she remarried less than a year after Kendrick died. It was 7 in the morning when I walked out of that damp, cramped shed and headed toward the main house. The morning dew soaked through my cheap slippers, but I could not feel the cold. All I felt was the piece of paper crumpled tightly in my fist. I had not slept a single second. I had driven to the local telecommunications store the moment they unlocked their doors and bullied a sleepy manager into printing the routing logs for my number. It was real. The midnight call was real. I bypassed the grand mahogany front door and walked straight through the patio into the massive sunlit kitchen. The smell of fresh espresso and expensive artisan bacon filled the air, a stark contrast to the stale instant coffee I drank every morning. Rebecca was sitting at the massive marble island, tapping her flawlessly manicured nails against a tablet screen. Across from her sat Todd Vance, her new husband, and the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm. Todd was wearing a crisp designer suit, sipping a green detox juice, looking exactly like a man who believed he owned the world. They barely glanced up when my heavy boots stepped onto their pristine hardwood floor. I did not say good morning. I walked right up to the marble island and slapped the printed call log down right over Rebecca's tablet. She flinched, spilling a drop of her expensive coffee onto her silk robe. "Look at it," I said, my voice thick with decades of gravel and a fresh, suffocating layer of terror. "Look at the number, Rebecca." She rolled her pale blue eyes, clearly annoyed by my presence, ruining her perfect kitchen aesthetic. "Leon, please," she sighed, waving a hand dismissively. "It is way too early for your episodes. Todd and I have a massive board meeting in an hour." I pressed my calloused, scarred finger against the paper, refusing to let her look away. I tapped the highlighted row of numbers so hard the table shook. "That is Kendrick's number. He called me last night. I heard his voice, and then I heard a gunshot." Todd let out a slow, arrogant sigh. He set his green juice glass down, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and leaned back in his leather bar stool. "Leon, buddy," he said, using that patronizing tone normally reserved for small children and stray dogs. "Kendrick has been dead for 15 years. Phone companies recycle numbers all the time. It was probably just an automated spam call or a drunk dialed wrong number. You are letting your grief play tricks on your old mind." Again, I stared dead into Todd's eyes. I am not crazy. I know my own son's voice, and I know the sound of a gun discharging. Someone has the phone I put in his casket, or someone dug it up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a fraction of a second. The bored, annoyed housewife act vanished from Rebecca's face entirely. It was replaced by something entirely cold, calculating, and venomous. She stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the floor. She stepped uncomfortably close to me, lowering her voice so it would not echo up the grand staircase. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," she whispered, her eyes narrowing into slits. "My son Jackson is upstairs sleeping. He is 15 years old, he is brilliant, and he is finally happy. He thinks of Todd as his real father. He hardly even remembers Kendrick. If you ever, and I mean ever, breathe a single word of this sick ghost story nonsense to my son, I will end you. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached, my fists curled at my sides. You cannot stop me from finding out what happened to my boy, I shot back, refusing to break eye contact. Rebecca smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator baring its teeth right before it strikes the neck. I absolutely can stop you, Leon, she said smoothly. Look at yourself. You are a 75-year-old man living in a shed in my backyard, bursting into my kitchen, raving about late-night phone calls from corpses. Do you have any idea what they do to people who act like that? They put them on a 5150 psychiatric hold. Todd plays golf with the chief of psychiatry at the state medical board. One phone call from us and a pair of orderlies will drag you out of here in a straitjacket before noon. You will spend the rest of your miserable life staring at a padded wall, heavily medicated out of your mind. I turned my gaze to Todd, expecting at least a shred of human decency. Todd did not even look at me. He just picked up his tablet, swiped to the next page of the financial news, and took another sip of his juice. She is not joking, Leon Todd said casually, not even bothering to look up from the screen. Be a good boy. Go back to the shed. Take your blood pressure pills. Do not make us ruin your retirement over a bad dream. The old me, the man who used to bust heads during the union strikes back in the 70s, would have reached across that marble counter and choked the absolute life out of Todd Vance right there. My muscles twitched with the urge to destroy his smug face, but anger makes a man stupid. And stupid gets a black man locked up or killed, especially in a neighborhood like this. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of an outburst. I was not going to hand them the excuse they needed to throw me in an asylum. I looked at Rebecca. I looked at Todd. I did not say another word. I slowly reached out, picked up my crumpled piece of paper, turned around, and walked back out the patio door. I let them think they had won. I let them think they had broken the old man's spirit. Because true power does not announce itself with a screaming match. It works in the absolute silence. I walked back into the cold, damp shadows of my shed and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. I walked over to my cot, reached under the thin mattress, and pulled out a prepaid burner phone I kept hidden in an old cigar box. I dialed a number I had not called in almost 10 years. A gruff, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Yeah, Dexter, it is Leon, I said, keeping my voice low. I need your help. Dexter used to be a private investigator. He was the kind of guy who found things the police were either too lazy or too scared to look for. More importantly, he owed me his life from our days serving together in the military. He knew me better than anyone. He knew I did not ask for help unless the sky was falling. What is the play? Leon Dexter asked, the sleep immediately vanishing from his voice. Someone is playing games with my dead son, I said, staring at the dust motes floating in the thin beam of morning light piercing through the shed window. I need you to trace an IP address and a cell tower ping from a phone call I got last night. And Dexter, bring your sidearm. I think a ghost is trying to warn me about a murder. I sat on the edge of my military surplus cot, staring at the burner phone in my calloused hands. The silence in the shed was heavy, broken only by the steady drip of a leaky pipe in the corner. Every second that ticked by felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had spent 15 years trying to make peace with the dirt that covered my son. Now I was praying that the dirt would speak. When the phone finally vibrated against my palm, my heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed it to my ear. Dexter did not bother with a greeting. Leon, he said, his voice thick with a kind of nervous tension I had not heard since our days in the jungle. I ran the trace on the routing logs you gave me. I used every backdoor access I still have from my private investigator days. You need to sit down for this. I am sitting, I told him, my grip tightening on the plastic casing of the phone. Tell me it was a glitch. Tell me it was just some cruel prank from a scammer in a basement halfway across the world. I wish I could, old friend, Dexter replied slowly. But I traced the IP address of the incoming call. It did not bounce off a public cell tower. It did not come from anywhere near the cemetery where Kendrick is buried. It was routed through a closed, heavily encrypted internal wireless network, a private server. My brow furrowed. I wiped a bead of cold sweat from my forehead. What does that mean, Dexter? Talk to me in English. I build engines, I do not write code. It means the call came from inside a fortress. Dexter explained, the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly in the background of his end of the call. It came from an enterprise-grade network with military-level firewalls. I had to bounce through 3 different proxy servers just to get a read on the origin location. Leon, the call came from downtown. The financial district. My blood ran cold. The financial district. I am looking at the physical address right now, Dexter continued, his voice dropping to an absolute whisper. The IP address belongs to the corporate headquarters of Vance Global Technologies. Todd Vance. The name hit me like a crowbar across the jaw. I stopped breathing. The leaky pipe in the corner seemed to stop dripping. The entire world ground to a sickening, violently abrupt halt. Are you absolutely sure? I asked, my voice cracking, betraying the hurricane of emotions tearing through my chest. I am looking right at the registry, Leon. The phone that made the call to you last night is currently sitting securely inside Todd Vance's private server room on the 45th floor of his flagship building. I lowered the phone from my ear for a moment. My eyes locked onto the blank wooden wall of the shed, but I did not see wood. I saw the funeral. I saw the gray, merciless Detroit sky pouring rain over the open grave. I saw myself, a broken father, gently placing Kendrick's silver cell phone into his suit pocket before they closed the casket. And I saw Rebecca. I saw her standing on the other side of the grave, wrapped in a black designer trench coat, wiping away tears that I now realized were nothing but a cold, calculated performance. The realization tore through my soul, ripping away 15 years of quiet mourning and replacing it with a white-hot, blinding rage. The phone was never buried. Someone had reached into that casket or intercepted it before the funeral and taken it. They let me weep over an empty gesture. They let me bury a lie. Leon, Dexter called out through the tiny speaker. Are you still there? I brought the phone back to my mouth. I am here. Leon, you need to listen to me, Dexter warned, sounding genuinely terrified for me. If Todd has that phone and it's suddenly activated after 15 years to send you an audio file of a gunshot, we are not dealing with a simple robbery. Kendrick was a genius. He was building artificial intelligence algorithms that companies would kill for. Do you understand what I am saying? They did not just take the phone. I whispered, the horrifying truth finally settling into my bones. They took his life. Dexter stayed quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. We need that phone, Leon. If Kendrick hit a dead man switch on that device, if he left behind proof of what they did to him, it is trapped inside Todd's network. But Vance Global has a cybersecurity budget of $50 million a year. They have biometric locks, thermal cameras, and active threat monitoring. We cannot just walk in through the front door. We need a way to breach their internal network from the outside just to see what is on that phone. How do we do that? I asked, my mind racing through a dozen violent, impossible scenarios. We need a back door, Dexter said. We need someone who has direct, privileged access to Todd's private network. Someone who can ping that specific server without setting off the alarms. But honestly, Leon, it is impossible. You are a mechanic. I am a retired private eye. We do not have the tools or the skills to hack a billionaire tech mogul. If you go near that building, Todd will have his security arrest you. And if you tell the police about the phone, Todd will simply destroy it before they can get a warrant. We are locked out. Dexter was right. I was a man who understood torque and leverage, not firewalls and encryption keys. I felt a crushing wave of despair wash over me. For the first time since I heard my dead son's voice, I felt entirely powerless. Todd and Rebecca had built a kingdom on my son's blood, and they had locked themselves inside a castle I could not breach. I will figure something out, I told Dexter, though my voice lacked conviction. Just keep your lines open. I hung up the burner phone and buried my face in my rough, calloused hands. The air in the shed felt suffocating. I needed to breathe. I needed to think. I stood up and walked over to the small, grimy window that looked out over the sprawling, manicured backyard of the estate. The sun was fully up now, casting bright, mocking rays of light over the heated swimming pool and the perfect green lawn. And then I saw him, my grandson Jackson. He was sitting on the expansive outdoor patio wearing an oversized hoodie, completely absorbed in his own world. Spread out on the glass patio table in front of him were massive cardboard boxes adorned with bright, aggressive gaming logos. Jackson was carefully lifting a massive custom-built computer tower out of the foam packaging. The side panel was made of tempered glass, revealing a labyrinth of high-end graphics cards, liquid cooling tubes, and processors. It was a machine built for extreme computing power. I watched as Jackson eagerly plugged the machine into the outdoor power outlet and connected it to a sleek black router. Todd had bought it for him. Todd, the man who tried to buy Jackson's affection with expensive tech toys while slowly poisoning the boy's mind against his own grandfather. My eyes narrowed as I watched the boy work. Jackson was not just a kid who liked video games. He had Kendrick's blood in his veins. He had my son's brilliant, restless mind. Jackson spent all his free time writing code, participating in online hacking challenges, and building software. He was a prodigy just like his father. And more importantly, Todd trusted him. Todd loved to brag to his rich friends about how smart his stepson was. Todd would have absolutely given Jackson's new supercomputer unrestricted privileged access to the Vance Global Home Network, a network that was undoubtedly linked directly to Todd's corporate servers. A slow, dangerous realization began to form in my mind. The despair that had been choking me just moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I did not need to be a hacker. I did not need to break down the walls of Todd's fortress from the outside. Todd had already invited the Trojan horse inside his own gates. He had bought the weapon and placed it right in the hands of the one person who could use it. I looked at my grandson, his face illuminated by the bright neon startup lights of the new computer. Jackson thought I was just a crazy old man who lived in the shed. Rebecca had spent years building a wall between us. But underneath all that brainwashing, Jackson was still a Carter. He was still my blood. And he loved a challenge. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my shirt, took a deep breath, and unlocked the heavy door of the shed. The path to my son's killers was not through the police, and it was not through a frontal assault. It was through a 15-year-old boy sitting on the patio. I stepped out into the bright morning sun, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path as I walked toward the patio. It was time to see just how fast Jackson's new computer really was. The heavy glass patio door slid open with a soft whisper as I stepped out into the morning heat. The sun was reflecting off the pristine surface of the swimming pool, throwing dancing shadows against the white stucco walls of the mansion. Jackson did not look up. He was entirely consumed by the massive machine sitting on the glass table in front of him. The computer tower was a beast of glass and metal humming with the quiet intensity of a high-performance engine. Neon blue liquid cooling tubes pulsed rhythmically like glowing veins pumping life into the silicon heart of the machine. I stood a few feet away just watching him for a moment. He had Kendrick's jawline and his intense, focused eyes. Rebecca had spent the last 15 years trying to scrub my son from this boy's DNA, but you cannot wash away blood. It broke my heart to know I was about to use my own grandson as a lockpick, but I had no choice. The men who murdered his father were sleeping comfortably inside that giant house, and this boy was holding the only key to their destruction. I took a slow breath and walked over, projecting the calm, steady demeanor of an old man with nothing but time on his hands. "That is a serious piece of hardware you have there," I said, keeping my voice casual. Jackson jumped, slightly startled by my sudden appearance. He quickly minimized a window on his screen and looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and caution. "Mom says you are supposed to stay in the backyard, Grandpa," he muttered, adjusting his glasses. "She says you are having another one of your bad days." "She tells you a lot of things, Jackson," I replied, pulling out a wrought iron patio chair and slowly sitting down opposite him. "I am perfectly fine. I just came out to admire the machinery. Back in the day when I was building muscle cars in Detroit, we used to measure a machine by its horsepower and its torque. I imagine this thing has a different kind of engine." Jackson hesitated. Rebecca had trained him to ignore me, but he was 15, and he was a nerd who was immensely proud of his new toy. He could not resist the opportunity to brag. "It is not just an engine, Grandpa," he said, sitting up a little straighter. "It is a custom-rigged processing unit. Todd bought the base parts, but I modified the motherboard myself. I overclocked the CPU and bypassed the standard thermal limits. It is probably the fastest rig in the entire state right now." I nodded slowly, letting a small, impressed smile touch the corners of my mouth. I rubbed my chin, acting like I was skeptical. "That sounds real nice on paper, kid, but anybody can bolt a shiny exhaust onto a junk car and call it a racer. Does it actually have teeth, or is it just for playing those flashy video games in high definition?" Jackson frowned, his pride instantly wounded. "It is not for video games," he snapped defensively. "I run complex compiling scripts on this. I can decrypt standard security firewalls in under 3 minutes. I can map entire data networks faster than the commercial software the government uses." I leaned forward, resting my thick forearms on the glass table. I let my eyes lock onto his, challenging him. "Mapping a public network is easy work, Jackson. That is like driving on an empty highway. But what if you had to break into a real fortress? What if you had to map a private enterprise network? Let us say a network with military-grade firewalls like the one Todd runs downtown. Could your little glowing box handle that, or would it stall out?" Jackson let out a short, arrogant laugh. "Todd is a genius at business, Grandpa, but he is lazy with his personal tech. He works from the home office all the time, and he hates logging in repeatedly. He set up a continuous encrypted tunnel from the house router directly to the Vance Global private servers. He thinks because the tunnel is encrypted, no one can see it. But he left the back door wide open on our end. If I wanted to, I could ride his tunnel right into the corporate mainframe and scan every server on the 45th floor without triggering a single external alarm. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. He had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I kept my face entirely blank, masking the rush of adrenaline. "Talk is cheap, Jackson," I said, waving a dismissive hand. "Todd spends $50 million a year on cybersecurity. I highly doubt a teenager on a patio could bypass it just because he found a loose wire in the router. Your machine would probably overheat before you even got past the first proxy." Jackson glared at me, his fingers hovering over his mechanical keyboard. "You really think I cannot do it?" he asked, his voice tight with teenage defiance. "I think you are a smart boy," I said softly, "but I think Todd's security team would swat you away like a mosquito. Prove me wrong. Show me the horsepower. Show me how fast you can sweep his private server room and pull the IP addresses of every device connected to it." I held my breath. If Rebecca walked out to the patio right now and saw Jackson hacking into Todd's company, it would be over. Todd would have me committed by noon. But Jackson did not look at the house. He looked at the screen. His fingers struck the keyboard with blinding speed. "Watch this," he whispered. The bright, flashy graphics on his monitor vanished. The screen went pitch black. Lines of glowing green text began scrolling down the monitor so fast they blurred together. Jackson's eyes darted back and forth, reading the code as it flew by. "I am bypassing the local router security," he explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I am latching onto Todd's active VPN tunnel. His security protocols are designed to look for outside intruders attacking the front gate. They do not check the traffic coming from the CEO's personal home network. They assume we are already verified." The heavy fans inside the glass computer tower suddenly roared to life, spinning faster to cool the overworked processors. The blue liquid in the tubes flowed rapidly. It sounded exactly like an engine being pushed to the absolute red line. "I am in Jackson," said a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I am inside the Vance Global Central mainframe. Now I am routing the search protocol to the private server room on the 45th floor, initiating a deep sweep of all connected hardware." The green text on the screen shifted into a massive grid of numbers and status bars. It was mapping out the digital architecture of the building where my son's stolen phone was being kept. I gripped the armrests of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white. "Look at that speed," Jackson boasted, pointing at a progress bar that was shooting toward 100%. "It is cataloging hundreds of devices per second. Workstations, security cameras, biometric scanners. It is finding everything. I told you, Grandpa, this machine does not stall." I stared at the screen, desperately looking for anything that resembled a cellular device IP. "Are you finding everything?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Every single piece of hardware in that room." "Everything," Jackson confirmed. "The sweep is almost complete. It is completely clean." But then the rhythmic humming of the computer fans stuttered. The smooth scrolling of the green text abruptly halted. The screen froze for a fraction of a second before a harsh, flashing red box appeared in the center of the monitor. Jackson frowned, leaning closer to the screen. His triumphant smile faded instantly, replaced by a look of deep confusion. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. "Did they catch us?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Are they locking you out?" "No," Jackson said, his fingers flying across the keyboard trying to isolate the red warning box. "It is not a security countermeasure. The sweep hit a snag. It found an anomaly." "What kind of anomaly?" I demanded, leaning over the table. Jackson's eyes were wide as he read the diagnostic report. "It is a ghost IP," he whispered, sounding genuinely spooked. "Grandpa, the sweep found a device physically plugged into the central server rack in the private room. But it is not a normal server. It is an incredibly old piece of hardware. The system registry says it has been completely dormant offline for 15 years. My breath caught in my throat. It was Kendrick's phone. Todd had kept it plugged directly into the heart of his empire, trying to crack it for over a decade. "Why is it flashing red?" I asked, staring at the screen. "Because my sweep just touched it," Jackson replied, his voice trembling slightly. The device was in a deep sleep state, but when my scanning protocol pinged its IP address to catalog it, the ping acted like a digital electric shock. Jackson looked up slowly from the monitor, his eyes meeting mine. "Grandpa, my scan did not just find the device. It woke it up. Whatever has been sleeping on that server for 15 years is now active, and it is trying to establish a direct connection to this computer right now." The screen went entirely white. Jackson threw his hands up to shield his eyes. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the concrete patio. The massive glass computer tower sitting on the table did not just hum anymore, it roared. The cooling fans spun so violently the entire table vibrated under my hands. "Grandpa, what did you make me do?" Jackson panicked, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "It is not just establishing a connection. It is forcing a handshake protocol. It is bypassing my own firewalls. Kill the power," I told him, reaching for the thick black cord plugged into the wall. "No," Jackson shouted, swatting my hand away. "If you cut the power during an aggressive handshake, it could fry the motherboard. Just let me write a kill script." His fingers hammered the keyboard, but the machine refused to listen. A massive black box opened in the center of the screen. Lines of red code began pouring down the black void like blood raining down a window pane. The computer was completely out of his control. "It is a dead man's switch," Jackson whispered, his face pale in the glow of the monitor. "What does that mean?" I asked, though the dread already pooling in my stomach gave me the horrible answer. "It means whoever programmed that sleeping device on Todd's server set a trap," Jackson explained, his eyes wide with fear. "If anyone ever found the device and tried to ping it, the device would instantly lock onto the intruder and force a data dump. It is downloading something directly onto my hard drive right now, and it is massive." "Can you stop it?" I demanded, leaning closer to the screen. Jackson shook his head frantically, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The encryption is military grade. I have never seen anything like this. The architecture of this code is beautiful, but it is absolutely aggressive. It is locking me out of my own operating system until the transfer is complete." We watched in terrifying silence as a progress bar appeared at the bottom of the black box. 10%, 30%, 60%. The file was tearing through the encrypted tunnel Todd had set up, transferring 15 years of buried secrets straight into my grandson's bedroom computer. I stared at the red lines of code flying across the glass monitor. My chest felt tight. I thought about the funeral in Detroit. I thought about how helpless I felt watching the dirt fall on my boy. For 15 years, Todd and Rebecca thought they had buried the truth forever. They thought they had won because they had all the money and all the power. They never realized that Kendrick was 10 times smarter than both of them combined. Even from the grave, my son was still fighting back. 90%. 100. The roaring fans instantly dropped to a quiet whisper. The red code vanished. The screen returned to Jackson's normal desktop background. But sitting right in the middle of the screen was a single unlabeled folder. "Open it," I commanded, my voice leaving no room for argument. Jackson swallowed hard, his hand trembling on the mouse. He double-clicked the folder. 2 files sat inside. One was a massive data package, completely locked behind layers of complex cryptographic code. The other was a simple audio file. "Play the audio," I said, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. Jackson clicked the audio file. The patio speakers cracked with heavy static. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of digital interference. Then a voice broke through the noise. It was distorted, heavily corrupted by whatever degradation the hardware had suffered over 15 years, but I knew that voice. Any father would know that voice. It was Kendrick. "It is in the code," the voice on the recording gasped, sounding breathless and terrified. "They do not know about the failsafe. If anything happens to me, the algorithm is—" The audio cut out abruptly, replaced by a screeching burst of digital feedback. Jackson slammed his hands over his ears. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his chest heaving with panic. "Grandpa, whose voice was that? Why does it sound like that?" I could not answer him immediately. My throat was sealed shut. Kendrick had known. He knew they were coming for him. He had coded a failsafe, a digital ghost designed to haunt his killers from the grave. And now I had it. "We just hacked Todd's most secure server," Jackson stammered, standing up and backing away from the table. "We just stole encrypted corporate data. This is a federal crime, Grandpa. Todd is going to kill me. I need to tell my mom. I need to go inside right now and tell my mom what happened so Todd can fix this." Jackson turned toward the sliding glass door of the mansion, ready to run to the woman who had lied to him his entire life. I moved faster than a 75-year-old man had any right to move. I stepped right into his path, blocking the glass door. My broad shoulders completely blocked his view of the house. My shadow swallowed him. "You are not going to tell your mother anything," I said. My voice was no longer the soft, tired tone of an old man living in a shed. It was the voice of a Detroit mechanic who had fought in the jungles and survived the brutal Union strikes. It was a voice made of iron and gravel. "Move!" Grandpa Jackson pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. "You do not understand what Todd can do. He will send me to juvenile detention. I have to tell them it was an accident." I grabbed Jackson by both shoulders. My grip was tight enough to let him know I was in absolute control, but not tight enough to hurt him. I forced him to look me dead in the eye. "Listen to me very carefully, Jackson," I said, staring into his terrified face. "The man whose voice you just heard on that recording was your real father. My son." Jackson froze. The breath hitched in his throat. He looked from my face to the speakers and back to me. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "Your mother and Todd have lied to you your entire life," I told him, refusing to look away. "Todd did not build this company. Your father built the technology that made Todd a billionaire. And then your father wound up dead. That file sitting on your computer is the truth they have been trying to hide for 15 years. No, Jackson shook his head, trying to pull away. "You are lying. Mom said you were sick. She said you make things up because you are old and confused." I let go of his shoulders and reached over to his computer tower. I ripped the side glass panel off the machine, entirely ignoring the warning beeps the system made. I reached inside and grabbed the massive secondary hard drive where the file had downloaded. I yanked it out, snapping the connecting wires with a sharp crack. I shoved the hard drive deep into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. "I am not sick, Jackson," I said, standing tall. "I am the only person in this world who is actually trying to protect you. If you walk into that house right now and tell your mother about this file, you will not go to juvenile detention. You will be in grave danger. The people inside that house are not your family. They are the people who stole your father's life and built an empire on his bones." Jackson stood entirely paralyzed. The teenage arrogance was completely gone. It was replaced by the terrifying realization that his entire reality was a fabricated illusion. He looked at the massive, beautiful mansion he called home as if it were a cage filled with predators. He finally understood that the old man in the shed was not crazy. Before Jackson could say another word, the computer monitor flashed a brilliant, blinding red. This time it was not a download box. It was a massive warning siren filling the entire screen and painting our faces in a harsh crimson glow. "Warning active trace detected," the computer announced in a sharp, robotic voice. Jackson spun around, staring at the screen in absolute horror. He rushed to the keyboard, trying to type a abort command, but the keyboard was completely locked. The mouse was dead. The system belonged to someone else now. "Grandpa," he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The dead man switch did not just send us the file. It acted like a digital flare gun." "What does that mean?" I asked, stepping up beside him and staring at the flashing red screen. "It means Todd's security team just woke up," Jackson replied, pointing at a digital map on the screen. The map showed a bright red line connecting the downtown corporate tower directly to our location on the patio. "The scan is no longer invisible." Jackson continued, his hands shaking. "They know the private servers were breached, and they know exactly where the breach came from. They traced the signal back through the VPN tunnel straight to this exact IP address." "How much time do we have before they know it is this specific house?" I asked. Jackson swallowed hard, staring at the blinking red light on his internet router. "None," he said. "They already know. Todd's security team is going to lock down this house, and they are going to call him right now." I walked away from the patio, leaving Jackson frozen in the shadow of his own house. I did not look back. I slipped out the side gate of the estate, my hand gripping the cold metal of the severed hard drive inside my canvas jacket pocket. I climbed into my rusted old truck and drove across town toward the industrial district. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was incredibly sharp. I drove through the neglected streets of Detroit, leaving the manicured lawns and gated mansions far behind me. Dexter lived above an abandoned auto parts store in a neighborhood the city had forgotten. The wooden stairs groaned under my heavy boots as I climbed up to his apartment. Dexter unlocked the heavy steel reinforced door before I even had the chance to knock. He took one look at my face and knew everything had changed. I reached into my pocket and handed him the hard drive. It felt heavy with 15 years of buried lies and silent suffering. We did not waste time with pleasantries. We walked straight over to his desk, which was covered in multiple monitors, radio scanners, and tangled wires. Dexter plugged the drive into an isolated offline computer. He knew better than to connect a stolen Vance Global file to the open internet. Todd had billions of dollars and armies of security analysts. If we made one wrong digital move, Todd would find us. Dexter typed a series of commands, his fingers moving with a desperate, frantic rhythm. The dead man switch did exactly what it was programmed to do. Dexter said, his voice low and tight. It bypassed the network security, but the file itself is locked behind a secondary cryptographic wall. The data is heavily corrupted from sitting on a dormant server for over a decade. Give me a few minutes to run a brute force breaker protocol on the top layer. While the computer worked its way through the digital locks, I paced the worn wooden floor of the apartment. My mind drifted back to the worst night of my life. I remembered the heavy knock on my front door. I remembered the two police officers standing on my porch with their hats in their hands. They told me Kendrick had a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. They told me he lost control of his vehicle and wrapped it around a concrete pillar on the interstate. But I knew my son. Kendrick rarely drank alcohol. He obsessed over his work. He was a brilliant mind, completely consumed by his research. At the time of his death, Kendrick was on the verge of a massive breakthrough in artificial intelligence. He was building a revolutionary data compression algorithm. He was trying to figure out how to compress massive amounts of complex data without losing a single pixel of quality. It was the kind of technology that could change the world. But the police closed the case as a tragic accident. 2 weeks later, Todd Vance, who was just an aggressive, ruthless venture capitalist back then, swept in playing the role of the supportive friend. He married my grieving daughter-in-law. He absorbed my son's startup company into his own corporate portfolio. And he threw me into a shed in the backyard. A loud chime from the computer pulled me violently back to the present. "We are through the first layer," Dexter announced, leaning closer to the glowing screen. I stopped pacing and walked over to the desk. "What is it?" I asked, staring at the massive blocks of text appearing on the monitor. "It is a patent draft," Dexter whispered, his eyes scanning the complex technical jargon. "It is the exact artificial intelligence architecture Kendrick had been building, the compression algorithm. But Leon, look at the names on the filing documents. Kendrick is not listed anywhere. Todd put his own name as the sole creator and owner of the intellectual property." Dexter opened a hidden financial directory attached to the patent folders. His face went entirely pale. "Leon, you need to see this," he said, pointing at a series of digital contracts. "Todd is not just sitting on this technology. He has been developing it in secret for 15 years, trying to piece together Kendrick's unfinished work. And he finally did it. There is a government contract here, a defense contract. Todd is scheduled to sell exclusive rights to this exact algorithm to the Pentagon next week. The purchase price is $2 billion. $2 billion. That was the price of my son's life. Todd did not just steal a company. He stole a global tech empire built on the blood and genius of my boy." "There is something else," Dexter said, his hands moving quickly across the keyboard. An audio file was embedded deep within the patent folders. It was heavily encrypted, but the forced download triggered by Jackson cracked the outer shell. "It is the same audio you heard on the patio, but this is the full track." "Play it," I commanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of pure rage and devastating grief. Dexter hit the enter key. The speakers hissed with loud, aggressive static. It was muffled, as if the phone was hidden deep inside a jacket pocket or shoved under a car seat. But the voices that broke through the digital noise were absolutely unmistakable. It was Todd. His voice was breathless and panicked. "The steering column is rigged," he said through the heavy static. "Are you absolutely sure the dosage was high enough, Rebecca?" Then came Rebecca's voice. It was cold, steady, and completely devoid of human emotion. "It was enough thallium to stop a horse's heart, Todd. Just push his body behind the wheel and pour the whiskey all over his clothes. The police will smell the cheap alcohol before they even bother to check his pulse. We have to make it look like he was drunk." The recording ended with the horrifying, sickening sound of crunching metal and shattered glass. I stood completely paralyzed in the dimly lit apartment. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. My son did not die in a tragic car crash. He was poisoned. The mother of his child had fed him thallium until his heart stopped beating. Then they staged a violent wreck to cover up the murder, all so they could steal his legacy and hand it over to the government for $2 billion. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails cut deeply into the palms of my hands. I did not cry. The sadness had burned away completely, leaving nothing but a cold, calculated, and absolute desire for total destruction. "I am going to kill them," I whispered, staring dead at the black computer screen. "I am going to tear their perfect lives apart, brick by brick." Before Dexter could say a single word, a high-pitched alarm pierced the heavy silence of the room. It was not coming from the computer. It was coming from the police scanner sitting on the edge of Dexter's crowded desk. Dexter reached over and quickly turned up the volume dial. A police dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio frequency. "All available units respond to a priority code 3 at the Vance estate in the gated community. The homeowner Todd Vance is reporting a violent domestic disturbance. The suspect is an elderly male named Leon Carter. Vance claims the suspect is suffering a severe psychotic break and is armed with a deadly weapon. Vance is requesting an immediate 5150 psychiatric hold and a full property search. Dexter looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine alarm. "Todd knows you breached his private server," he said quickly, grabbing his heavy coat from a chair. "He does not know exactly what you downloaded, but he knows you have something dangerous. He is using the police to raid your shed and lock you inside a psych ward before you can talk to anyone. They are going to tear your place apart." "Leon," Dexter continued, frantically unplugging the hard drive, "if they find you there, they will put you in a straitjacket and pump you full of heavy sedatives. Todd is your legal guardian on paper. He will have total control over your medical directives. You will disappear into an asylum and you will never see the light of day again." I looked at the hard drive sitting in Dexter's hand. The evidence was right there, but it was only a small piece of the puzzle. The audio was muffled and legally incomplete. It would never hold up in a federal court against Todd's army of expensive corporate lawyers. They would claim it was a digital fabrication, an artificial intelligence deepfake created by a crazy old man. I needed the physical phone. I needed the original, uncorrupted hardware still locked inside Todd's corporate tower. "Let them come," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady growl. "Let them search the shed. They will not find anything but old mechanic tools and empty cardboard boxes." "You cannot go back there," Dexter warned, stepping in front of me. "If they catch you on that property, it is over. They will shoot you or they will drug you." "I am not running," I told him, meeting his terrified gaze with absolute icy calm. "We are going to play this game exactly the way Todd wants to play it. But I need you to make a phone call right now. Call Dr. Sterling. Tell him I need the paperwork we prepared yesterday morning. Todd wants to use the law to bury me alive. I am going to use the law to break his jaw." I drove my rusted old truck back through the massive wrought iron gates of the Vance estate. The private security guard at the front booth gave me a long, suspicious look before he finally pressed the button to let me inside. He knew I lived in the backyard shed. He knew I did not belong among these massive stone mansions and perfectly manicured lawns. I parked my truck out of sight behind a row of tall hedges and walked calmly back to my small wooden prison. I did not pack a bag. I did not try to hide my few belongings. I just sat down on my stiff military cot, resting my rough hands on my knees, and I waited for the storm to hit. It did not take long. Less than 20 minutes later, the screaming wail of police sirens shattered the quiet afternoon peace of the wealthy neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively through the small, grimy window of my shed, painting the dark wooden walls in harsh, violent colors. I heard the heavy, aggressive crunch of tires skidding onto the pristine gravel driveway. I stood up slowly and pushed my heavy wooden door open just a few inches so I could watch the scene unfold. 2 massive police cruisers and a white ambulance had surrounded the main house, blocking the driveway completely. 4 police officers stepped out of their vehicles with their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty equipment belts. Todd Vance was standing on the front lawn looking like a man completely unhinged by fear. But I knew it was an absolute performance. Todd was a master manipulator. He was wearing a casual but incredibly expensive cashmere sweater, his hair perfectly tousled to make him look like a stressed father who had just rushed home from a billion-dollar company to save his family from a monster. Rebecca was standing right behind him, clutching Jackson tightly by the shoulders. Jackson looked pale and terrified, but he was not looking at the police. He was staring at the ground. One of the police officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man, approached Todd. I could hear every word they said carrying clearly across the quiet, open space of the yard. "Officer, thank God you got here so fast," Todd said, his voice trembling with perfectly manufactured panic. "He is out back in the converted shed. My father-in-law, Leon, he has completely lost his mind." "Take a breath, sir," the officer said, pulling out a small black notepad. "Is he armed right now? Is anyone in the house hurt?" He had a heavy steel mechanic hammer. Todd lied, his face twisting into an expression of absolute horror. "I came home because our security system flagged a network error." When I walked out to the patio, Leon was screaming at my 15-year-old son. He was waving the hammer right in Jackson's face, ranting about ghosts and corporate espionage and dead bodies. "Officer, he is a 75-year-old man suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia. He thinks the government is listening to him. He thinks my wife and I are trying to poison his food." The officer nodded sympathetically, looking past Todd toward the backyard where my shed was located. "Has he been taking his prescribed medication, Mr. Vance?" "No," Todd answered, shaking his head, sadly wiping an invisible tear from his eye. He refuses to take his pills. He has been spiraling downward for weeks. Officer, I have the medical power of attorney over him. I am his legal guardian on paper. I am requesting an immediate 5150 involuntary psychiatric hold. He is a direct and imminent danger to himself and my family. You need to restrain him and get him to the state hospital immediately before he kills someone. And I need your men to sweep that shed to make sure he has not built any weapons or dangerous devices in there. I listened to his words from the shadows of the shed, and I realized just how brilliant and evil Todd truly was. He did not just want me locked up for revenge. He wanted a legal excuse for the police to toss my shed upside down. He knew I had downloaded something from his private server, and he wanted the police to find the hard drive and the burner phone. He wanted the cops to do his dirty work for him while he played the innocent victim. If the police found any computer equipment, they would just hand it straight back to Todd, thinking it was the stolen junk of a crazy old man. The tall officer turned to his partner and gave a sharp tactical nod. 2 paramedics stepped out of the back of the ambulance. One of them was carrying a heavy canvas straitjacket covered in thick leather belts. The other paramedic opened a medical kit and pulled out a large, thick syringe filled with a clear, heavy liquid. They were preparing to sedate a violent animal. I did not wait for them to kick my door off its hinges. I took a deep breath, pushed the heavy wooden door wide open, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. My posture was completely straight. My hands were empty and resting openly at my sides. My face was as calm and unreadable as a frozen lake. "Drop the weapon," Leon Todd screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me across the yard. "Please just put the hammer down before they shoot you." There was no hammer. My hands were entirely visible. But Todd was planting the seed of violence in the minds of the officers. He wanted the police to feel threatened. He wanted them to react with immediate and overwhelming physical force. "Sir, keep your hands exactly where I can see them," the tall officer shouted, drawing his yellow taser and aiming the red laser dot directly at the center of my chest. "Step away from the structure and get down on your knees immediately." I did not get down on my knees. I had bowed down to these terrible people for 15 years just to stay close to my grandson. I was absolutely done bowing. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, keeping my hands completely open and raised just below my shoulders so they could see I was not reaching for my pockets. "I do not have a weapon, officer," I said, my voice entirely steady, carrying the quiet, firm authority of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I am completely unarmed. I have not threatened anyone today." "He is lying," Todd yelled, stepping safely behind the broad shoulders of the police officers. He hid the hammer in his jacket. "He is experiencing a violent psychotic delusion. Grab him before he hurts somebody. Please, you have to sedate him right now." The officers advanced quickly, crossing the manicured grass and closing the distance between us. The paramedics followed closely behind them, their expressions tight with professional tension. They were not going to ask me any questions. They were not going to listen to my side of the story. They had a wealthy, respected corporate executive telling them I was a lethal threat. In a gated community like this, the word of a billionaire is the absolute law. The word of an old black man living in a backyard shed is nothing but noise. Over the shoulders of the advancing police, I locked eyes with my grandson. Jackson was physically trembling. He knew I never had a hammer. He knew Todd was lying to the police to cover up the fact that we had breached the corporate servers. The boy opened his mouth to speak, to tell the officers the truth about what really happened on the patio. But Rebecca saw him hesitating. She dug her perfectly manicured nails violently into Jackson's shoulder, pulling him back against her. She whispered something incredibly vicious in his ear, and the boy squeezed his eyes shut, completely paralyzed by his own terror. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the lead officer commanded, closing the final gap between us. He grabbed my left arm with brutal professional force, twisting my wrist upward toward my shoulder blades, trying to force me into a painful submission hold. I did not resist the physical force. I let him pull my arm back. The second officer grabbed my right shoulder, shoving me roughly against the coarse wooden siding of my shed. The rough wood scraped against my cheek. The paramedics stepped up right behind the officers. I could hear the heavy metal buckles of the canvas straitjacket clinking together as they unspooled the straps. I could smell the harsh chemical scent of the powerful sedative dripping from the needle of the syringe. They were going to erase my mind. They were going to inject me with chemicals and lock me inside a padded room where no one would ever listen to a single word I said. And Todd Vance was standing on the beautiful green lawn watching his perfect, flawless victory unfold with a cold, invisible smile on his face. The heavy canvas straps of the straitjacket grazed my forearms. The paramedic holding the syringe stepped closer. his eyes completely devoid of empathy. He swabbed a cold patch of rubbing alcohol onto the thick vein of my neck. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I knew that any sudden movement, any raised voice or display of panic would be the exact justification they needed to push that plunger and erase my mind. I kept my breathing slow and deliberate. "Officer," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and completely calm, "before you let this man inject chemicals into my bloodstream, I need you to do one thing. Shut him up," Todd shouted from the safety of the manicured lawn. "He is just trying to confuse you. Restrain him right now." I ignored Todd entirely and kept my eyes locked on the lead police officer, holding my shoulder against the rough wood of the shed. "Look inside the shed, officer," I said. "Right next to the door there is a small wooden table. On that table there is a thick yellow manila folder. Just open it and read the first page. If you still feel the need to strap me down after you read that document, I give you my word as a veteran of the armed forces that I will willingly put my arms inside that canvas jacket, and I will not fight you." The officer paused. He looked at my face, searching for the erratic twitching of a madman, but he found nothing but the quiet dignity of a man completely at peace with his situation. He looked over his shoulder at Todd, who was frantically gesturing for them to finish the job. Then the officer looked at his partner. "Hold him here," the lead officer commanded. He stepped past me and walked into the cramped, dimly lit space of my shed. I heard the rustle of heavy paper as he picked up the folder. I had left it right there in plain sight for this exact moment. For 15 years I had known Todd Vance was a snake, but yesterday, when the burner phone rang, I knew the snake was finally going to strike. So Dexter and I did not just prepare a digital counterattack, we prepared a legal shield. Dexter had called in a massive favor from Dr. Marcus Sterling, the chief of neurology and psychiatric evaluation at Detroit General Hospital. Dr. Sterling owed Dexter his career. Yesterday afternoon, I had sat in a sterile white room for 4 hours, undergoing every rigorous mental health screening, cognitive exam, and psychological stress test known to modern medicine. Inside the shed, the officer began to read the document. His eyes scanned the heavy black ink, the official hospital letterhead, and the undisputed signature of the top neurologist in the entire state of Michigan. The officer stepped back out into the sunlight. His demeanor had completely shifted. The aggressive tension in his shoulders vanished. He looked at the paramedic holding the needle and gave a sharp shake of his head. "Put that away," he ordered. "What are you doing?" Todd demanded, marching across the grass, his face flushing with angry red patches. "I have medical power of attorney. I gave you a legal directive to secure him." The officer walked right up to Todd and shoved the yellow folder against Todd's chest. "The man standing there is Leon Carter," the officer said, his voice loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "According to this comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, dated less than 24 hours ago and signed by the chief of neurology at Detroit General Hospital, Mr. Carter exhibits exceptional cognitive function. The report specifically notes 0 signs of dementia, 0 indicators of paranoia, and absolute full command of his mental faculties." Todd's mouth fell open. He snatched the folder from the officer's hand and stared at the medical seal as if it were a bomb about to detonate in his face. "This is fake," Todd stammered, his eyes darting frantically across the page. "He forged this. He is a mechanic. He does not know doctors like this." "You can call the hospital right now and verify the certificate number, sir," the officer replied, his tone turning cold and authoritative. "But let me make this incredibly clear to you, Mr. Vance. You called emergency dispatch reporting a violent, schizophrenic man armed with a deadly weapon threatening a child. We responded with maximum force based on your word. We found an unarmed cooperative senior citizen with a gold standard mental health clearance. We searched the immediate vicinity and found no hammer. We found no weapon of any kind." "He hid it," Todd insisted, desperately pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have to tear that shed apart. You have to search his belongings." "We do not have a warrant to search his private living quarters, sir," the officer stated firmly, stepping between me and Todd. "And frankly, given the nature of this completely unsubstantiated emergency call, I highly doubt any judge in this county would grant us one." The second officer released his grip on my shoulder and stepped back. The paramedics quickly packed their equipment, returning to the ambulance, clearly annoyed that their time had been wasted. "Let him go," Todd screamed, his perfect composed billionaire facade finally cracking completely. "I pay the property taxes on this estate. I pay your salaries. I am telling you that man is a threat to my company and my family." The lead officer narrowed his eyes, leaning in close to Todd. "I do not care how much money you have, Mr. Vance," the officer warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You do not use the police department as your personal private security force to handle your family disputes. If you ever call us out to this address again on a fabricated emergency report, I will personally put you in handcuffs for filing a false police report and wasting emergency city resources. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" Todd stood completely frozen, unable to form a coherent sentence. He was a man used to buying his way out of every problem, used to snapping his fingers and watching the world bend to his will. But right now, the law was a brick wall he could not simply walk through. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Carter," the officer said, turning to me with a respectful nod. "Thank you for your professionalism, officer," I replied, adjusting the collar of my jacket. I watched in absolute silence as the police officers got back into their cruisers. The ambulance backed out of the driveway, followed by the 2 squad cars. The heavy iron gates of the estate clicked shut behind them. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared, leaving the massive yard entirely quiet once again. Rebecca was still standing on the porch holding Jackson. She looked absolutely terrified. She realized that I had outsmarted her husband at his own game. Jackson looked at me from across the yard. I gave him a slow, reassuring nod. The boy quickly looked away, but I knew he understood. The old man was not crazy. Todd slowly turned around to face me. The yellow medical folder was crushed in his fist. The fake tears, the panicked father routine, all of it melted away. His eyes were dark, completely devoid of humanity. He looked at me not as an annoying father-in-law, but as a genuine lethal threat to his $2 billion empire. "You think you are clever, old man," Todd whispered, his voice carrying across the empty space between us. "You think a piece of paper is going to save you from me? I own the ground you walk on. I own the roof over your head. You own nothing, Todd," I replied, keeping my voice flat and emotionless. "You are standing on a house built with stolen money and dead men's bones, and the ground is starting to shake." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back to him, walked into my shed, and closed the heavy wooden door. I locked the deadbolt. I had won the battle, but the war had just escalated to a terrifying new level. Todd now knew that I was actively planning something. He knew I had the mental capacity to fight back, and he knew I had outside help to secure that medical document. I sat down on my cot and pulled the burner phone from under the mattress. I needed to call Dexter. I needed to know if he had managed to clean up the corrupted audio file. If we could isolate the recording of Todd and Rebecca planning the murder, we could bypass the local police entirely and take the file straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But as I dialed the first 3 numbers of Dexter's phone, the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling of the shed flickered violently. It buzzed like an angry hornet for 2 seconds before snapping off completely, plunging the shed into absolute darkness. The low, familiar hum of the small mini refrigerator in the corner groaned and died. The small electric space heater that kept the damp evening chill out of my bones clicked off. I stood up in the pitch-black room and walked over to the small metal sink. I grabbed the cold metal faucet handle and turned it all the way to the left. Nothing came out. Not a single drop. There was only a hollow, ghostly hiss of empty copper pipes. I looked out the small, grimy window toward the main house. The mansion was blazing with bright, warm light. Every window was illuminated. Todd was standing on the back patio staring directly at my dark shed. He was holding a heavy pair of industrial wire cutters in one hand and a large wrench in the other. He had physically severed the main electrical line and shut off the water valve feeding the backyard structure. Todd had dropped the nice guy act entirely. He could not use the police to drag me out, so he was going to use brutal, primitive tactics. He was going to freeze me out. He was going to starve me out. He was turning my sanctuary into a dark, freezing tomb. The siege had officially begun. The darkness inside the shed was absolute. Without the small electric heater, the damp Michigan cold began to seep through the thin wooden walls, settling deep into my old bones. I sat perfectly still on the edge of my cot, listening to the silence. Todd had cut the power and the water, hoping to break my spirit. He wanted me to freeze. He wanted me to crawl to his back door begging for warmth. But Todd did not understand the kind of man I was. I grew up in the brutal winters of Detroit. I had survived labor strikes where men beat each other with steel pipes just to secure a decent wage. A cold shed was nothing to me. But I knew Todd would not stop at cutting the power. He was a billionaire used to getting his way immediately. When the police failed him, his frustration would push him towards something much more primitive and dangerous. He needed to find the hard drive he thought I was hiding, and he needed to punish me for humiliating him in front of his wife and my grandson. I reached under my mattress and wrapped my thick, calloused fingers around the cold, heavy iron of a 24-inch pipe wrench. I had brought it with me from my old mechanic shop. Todd had lied to the police about me having a hammer. He gave me an idea. I sat in the pitch-black room, breathing slowly, conserving my energy. An hour passed. Then 2. The main house went completely dark. Todd and Rebecca went to sleep, feeling perfectly safe in their fortress. Then I heard it. It was a sound that did not belong in a gated community, the heavy, clumsy crunch of boots stepping on the gravel path behind the shed. It was not the crisp, measured step of a private security guard. It was the careless, heavy footfall of street thugs. Todd had hired local muscle to do his dirty work. He wanted a staged robbery, a violent home invasion to take my files and beat me into submission. I stood up and pressed my back completely flat against the wooden wall right next to the door. I raised the heavy iron wrench, resting it against my shoulder. The metal handle of the door rattled violently. Someone was trying to pick the lock, but they were impatient. A second later, a heavy boot kicked the wooden door frame right near the deadbolt. The wood splintered with a loud crack. The door flew open violently, crashing against the interior wall. 2 massive silhouettes blocked the faint moonlight spilling into the shed. They were big men wearing heavy, dark jackets and ski masks. They expected to find a terrified 75-year-old man cowering under a blanket. They expected an easy paycheck from a rich tech executive. They stepped inside the shed, pulling small flashlights from their pockets. "Where is the old man?" One of them whispered, his voice rough and aggressive. "Find the computer junk and break his legs." I did not give them a chance to turn their lights toward me. I stepped out of the shadows, moving with the sudden, explosive violence of a man who had fought for his life in the gutters of Detroit. I swung the heavy iron wrench in a tight, brutal arc. The solid iron connected with the side of the first thug's knee with a sickening crunch. He screamed a high-pitched sound of absolute agony and collapsed instantly to the wooden floor, dropping his flashlight. The second thug spun around wild and panicked. He swung a heavy wooden baseball bat blindly into the dark. The bat caught me hard across the left shoulder. The impact was devastating. A shock wave of pure fire exploded through my collarbone, sending a jolt of blinding pain all the way down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heavy boots sliding on the floorboards. I was an old street fighter, but I was still 75 years old. My bones were not made of steel anymore. The thug raised the bat again, aiming directly for my head. I ducked violently, lunging forward and driving my right shoulder directly into his chest. We both crashed backward into my small metal table, sending tools and empty cardboard boxes scattering across the floor. I pinned him against the wall, pressing my forearm hard against his throat. He gagged, struggling to push my heavy weight off him. The first thug was rolling on the floor, groaning and trying to get back up. I could feel the hot blood pounding in my temples. My injured shoulder throbbed with a sickening rhythm. I was holding my own, but the reality of the situation hit me like a bucket of freezing water. I could break both of their jaws tonight. I could throw them out of my shed bleeding and broken. But if I won this fight, Todd would simply send 4 men tomorrow night. He had unlimited money. He could keep sending violent criminals until one of them finally got lucky and put a bullet in my head. I could not win a war of physical attrition against a billionaire. I needed to disappear. I needed to leave this property, but I needed to do it in a way that gave me an absolute airtight alibi. The thug beneath me threw a desperate heavy punch that caught me right on the jaw. I used the momentum of his punch to execute my plan. I let go of his throat and stumbled backward, completely dropping my heavy iron wrench. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. I grabbed the center of my chest with both hands. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a strangled, agonizing gasp. I dropped heavily to my knees, my breath coming in short, wet rasps. I looked up at the thug, my eyes wide with perfectly simulated mortal terror. "Help me." I choked out my voice, barely a whisper. My heart. I let my body go completely limp and collapsed sideways onto the cold wooden floor. I lay there staring blankly at the wall, taking incredibly shallow breaths, twitching my fingers just enough to look like a man dying from a massive cardiac event. The thug holding the baseball bat froze completely. He looked down at me, his chest heaving. His partner managed to pull himself up on one good leg, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "What did you do?" the injured thug hissed, staring at my motionless body. "I just hit him in the jaw." The other man panicked, dropping the wooden bat. "He is having a heart attack. He is dying." "Grab the hard drives," the injured man ordered, his voice cracking with fear. "We did not get paid to catch a murder charge. Just grab the box on the table and let us get out of here." The uninjured thug scrambled blindly in the dark, grabbing a small cardboard box filled with worthless old receipts and a broken radio part. He thought he had grabbed my hidden files. He grabbed his partner by the jacket, and the two of them stumbled out of the shed, running as fast as they could across the lawn and disappearing into the night. I lay perfectly still on the cold floor of the shed, listening to the silence return. The pain in my shoulder was absolutely excruciating, but my mind was crystal clear. Todd had sent men to hurt me. And now those men were going to call Todd and tell him the old man suffered a fatal heart attack during the robbery. Todd was going to call an ambulance, playing the role of the devastated son-in-law finding my body. He was going to send me to the hospital, and that was exactly where I needed to be. I closed my eyes and waited in the dark for the sirens to return. I lay there on the cold floorboards listening to the heavy boots of the thugs crunching across the gravel as they ran away. They took a box of garbage thinking they had stolen my leverage. I kept my breathing shallow. I knew Todd was watching from the main house. I knew he was waiting for his hired muscles to give him the all clear. But instead he got a panicked phone call from a criminal telling him the old man was dead on the floor. It took exactly 12 minutes for the sirens to return to the estate. Todd had to call 911 to keep his hands clean. I heard the paramedics kicking the splintered door open. Bright, tactical flashlights swept across the dark shed, blinding me through my half-closed eyelids. "He is unresponsive," one of the paramedics shouted, dropping his heavy medical bag next to my head. "Pulse is erratic and thready. He took a massive hit to the left shoulder. Looks like blunt force trauma." I let my body remain entirely limp as they rolled me onto a rigid backboard. I groaned softly, making sure my voice sounded weak and broken. "My chest," I whispered, letting my eyes roll back slightly. "It feels like a crushing weight. Left arm is numb." I knew exactly what symptoms to fake. When you spend 30 years working in the auto plants, you see plenty of good men drop dead on the assembly line from massive coronaries. I knew how to play the part of a dying man. They strapped an oxygen mask tightly over my face and rushed me out into the cold night air. As they lifted the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of Todd standing on the pristine lawn. He had his arm wrapped tightly around Rebecca. He was putting on a brilliant performance for the police officers who had arrived to investigate the break-in. He looked like a devastated family man. But in the brief second that our eyes met through the ambulance doors, I saw the absolute triumph in his cold, dead stare. He thought he had won. He thought the stress of the robbery had finally broken my old heart. The ride to Detroit General Hospital was a blur of flashing sirens and harsh fluorescent lights. They wheeled me directly through the emergency room doors, shouting medical codes that cleared the hallways. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, cutting away my heavy canvas jacket and attaching dozens of cold, sticky electrodes to my chest and arms. I did not fight them. I let them run their tests. Because I had taken a genuine, brutal hit from that baseball bat, my blood pressure was skyrocketing and my body was in a state of physical shock. The medical monitors beeped wildly, validating every symptom I was faking. "Admit him to the intensive care unit," the lead doctor ordered, looking at the printed readout from the electrocardiogram. "We need to monitor his cardiac enzymes. Get him on a continuous intravenous drip and keep him absolutely sedated. If he moves too much, he could trigger a secondary infarction." They wheeled me up to the 4th floor and pushed my bed into a sterile glass-walled room in the intensive care unit. The nurses worked quickly, hooking me up to a massive tower of medical machinery. A thick plastic clip was fastened to my index finger to monitor my oxygen. A blood pressure cuff was wrapped tightly around my bicep, set to inflate every 15 minutes. I was quite literally tied to the bed. If I tried to sit up or disconnect a single wire, the machines would instantly trigger a loud alarm at the central nursing station. I was trapped. I had successfully escaped the shed, but I had locked myself inside a high-security medical prison. Through the thick glass wall of my room, I watched the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swing open. Todd and Rebecca walked in. They had followed the ambulance to the hospital to play their roles to the bitter end. They spoke to the head nurse, putting on their sad, concerned faces. The nurse pointed toward my room, offering them a sympathetic nod. Todd walked slowly up to the glass. Rebecca stood right beside him. They did not come inside. They just stood there looking at me through the thick, transparent barrier. The intensive care unit was kept deliberately dim, but the light from the hallway illuminated their faces perfectly. Todd was smiling. It was not a broad, obvious smile. It was a subtle, arrogant smirk that twisted the corners of his mouth. He looked at the heavy machinery keeping me alive. He looked at the tubes running into my arms. He looked at me as if I were a piece of broken machinery that was finally ready for the scrapyard. He thought his $2 billion secret was absolutely safe. He thought the thugs had stolen the hard drive containing the encrypted data. He assumed that even if I survived the night, I would be a crippled old man permanently confined to a hospital bed or a nursing home. He thought the war was over, and he had emerged victorious. Rebecca leaned her head against Todd's shoulder, completely relaxed. She did not feel an ounce of guilt for the fact that I was lying in a hospital bed. She did not care that I was the grandfather of her child. She was only relieved that the annoying old ghost from her past was finally silenced. I stared back at them through the glass. I kept my breathing slow and steady, making sure the green line on my heart monitor remained perfectly calm. I did not glare at them. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing my anger. I just closed my eyes and let them believe their own lies. They watched me for another 10 minutes before Todd finally checked his expensive watch. He patted Rebecca's arm, and the two of them turned around and walked out of the intensive care unit completely satisfied. They were going back to their warm mansion to sleep soundly. Tomorrow, Todd had a board meeting to finalize the defense contract. He had billions of dollars waiting for him. The hours dragged on. The hospital settled into the quiet, rhythmic routine of the graveyard shift. The lights in the hallway were dimmed. The nurses at the central station were busy charting medical records and speaking in low, hushed whispers. I lay entirely still, calculating my next move. I was alive and I was out of the shed, but I was completely immobilized. The physical phone Kendrick had used to make the call was still plugged into the server room on the 45th floor of Vance Global. The hard drive I gave Dexter only had a corrupted audio file. Without the original hardware, Todd could still deny everything. I needed to get to that corporate tower tonight, but I was strapped to a bed that monitored every single heartbeat. If my heart rate elevated, the nurses would rush in. If I pulled the wires, the alarms would sound. I was a prisoner of modern medicine. The heavy sliding glass door of my room suddenly clicked open. The sound was so quiet it barely registered above the rhythmic hissing of the oxygen machine. I kept my eyes half closed, pretending to be asleep. A figure stepped into the dim room. It was a man wearing the light blue scrubs of a hospital orderly. He was pushing a small plastic cart loaded with fresh towels and medical supplies. He moved slowly, deliberately, making sure his rubber-soled shoes did not squeak against the linoleum floor. The orderly stopped at the foot of my bed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black electronic device that looked like a modified tablet. He did not check my chart. He did not look at my intravenous bags. He just stared directly at my face. I tensed my muscles, ready to fight. Todd could have easily paid a hospital worker to slip a lethal injection into my line. A heart attack in the intensive care unit would be the perfect clean end to his problem. But then the orderly reached up and pulled the blue surgical mask down around his neck. The dim light from the hallway caught his face. It was Dexter. He looked at the glowing monitors surrounding my bed and gave a low, quiet whistle. "You really committed to the role, Leon," he whispered, his gravelly voice barely audible over the machinery. "You look like hell." I opened my eyes, completely staring at my old friend. "How did you get past the nurses' station?" I asked, keeping my voice equally low. "I used to investigate medical fraud back in the 90s, Dexter replied, tapping the side of his head. "I know exactly how these night shifts operate." I walked in through the loading dock, grabbed a uniform from the laundry room, and picked up a cart. If you look like you belong and you walk with a purpose, nobody asks you any questions. I tried to shift my weight, but the sharp pain in my shoulder stopped me. "Todd thinks he won," I told him. "He thinks his thugs stole the data. He thinks I am stuck in this bed until I die." "Let him think that," Dexter said, pulling a small bundle of dark clothing from the bottom shelf of his supply cart. "He is sleeping right now, feeling like a king. That means his guard is down. We have a very small window of opportunity before the sun comes up." I looked at the tangled web of wires stuck to my chest. "Dexter, I am wired to a central monitoring system. The second I take off these electrode patches, an alarm is going to blare across this entire floor. 3 nurses will be in this room before I even get my boots on." Dexter smiled. It was a dangerous, cunning smile. He held up the small black electronic tablet he had pulled from his pocket. "That is why you called a guy who knows how to cheat the system, Leon," he whispered. Dexter pulled a small black electronic module from the deep pocket of his hospital scrubs. He stepped quickly to the side of my bed and inspected the tangled web of wires feeding into the massive heart monitor. He did not hesitate. He unplugged the main data cable connected to my chest electrodes and jammed it directly into his black module. Then he plugged the module back into the wall unit. The loud rhythmic beeping of the machine completely stopped for a fraction of a second. I held my breath, waiting for the alarms to sound. I waited for the heavy hospital doors to burst open and a team of nurses to rush in, but the silence remained unbroken. "Look at the screen," Dexter whispered, his voice incredibly low. I turned my head. The bright green line on the monitor was still moving up and down, tracing a perfectly healthy resting heartbeat. The oxygen level showed 98%. The blood pressure read completely normal. "I am feeding the central nursing station, a continuous 10-minute data loop," Dexter explained, tapping the side of his device. "As far as the hospital computers are concerned, you are lying in this bed heavily sedated and sleeping like a baby. You are officially incapacitated, Leon. You have the ultimate airtight alibi. Even if Todd suspects something, he can call the front desk right now, and the nurses will swear on their lives that you never left this room." I did not waste another second. I reached up and ripped the sticky electrode patches off my bare chest. The cold air of the intensive care unit hit my skin, causing a shiver to run down my spine. I pushed myself up from the mattress. The moment I put weight on my left arm, a blinding flash of absolute agony exploded through my shoulder. The thug with the baseball bat had done serious damage. A massive dark purple bruise covered my collarbone, radiating heat and pain. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to swallow the groan building in my throat. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and planted my bare feet on the cold linoleum floor. Dexter reached into the bottom shelf of his plastic supply cart and handed me a folded pile of dark blue surgical scrubs. I quickly pulled the scrubs on over my hospital gown. They were baggy and smelled strongly of industrial bleach, but they were exactly what I needed to become invisible. I turned back to the hospital bed. I grabbed the heavy white blankets and rolled them up, shaping them carefully to mimic the outline of a man's shoulders and torso. I pulled the sheets up high, tucking them neatly around the fake shape. I reached over to the wall panel and dimmed the room lights to their absolute lowest setting. From the hallway, looking through the thick glass window, it looked exactly like an old man resting quietly in the shadows. "We are on the clock," Dexter warned, checking his heavy steel wristwatch. "The graveyard shift nurses are relaxed, but the morning staff comes in at 6 to draw blood and check vitals. When they pull those sheets back and find empty space, all hell is going to break loose. We have exactly 4 hours to tear down a billionaire." I nodded slowly, pushing the pain in my shoulder to the deepest corner of my mind. "Let us go," I said. We walked out of the room together. Dexter pushed his plastic supply cart, and I walked right beside him, keeping my head bowed slightly. We stepped out into the main corridor of the intensive care unit. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. We approached the central nursing station. 3 nurses were sitting behind the high circular desk, staring at glowing computer monitors and sipping from foam coffee cups. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. If one of them recognized my face or noticed the awkward way I carried my injured shoulder, the entire plan would collapse. I would be dragged back to the bed and strapped down for good. I remembered what Dexter had told me about blending in. People do not see you if you look like you belong. They only see the uniform. I reached over to Dexter's cart and picked up a tall stack of clean white towels. I held them against my chest, using them to hide my face slightly and give my hands a purpose. I walked with the slow, exhausted shuffle of a hospital orderly nearing the end of a long, miserable shift. One of the nurses looked up from her screen as we passed. Her eyes swept over Dexter and then moved to me. Time seemed to slow down entirely. I kept my face completely blank. I did not speed up my pace. I just kept walking. She took a sip of her coffee, looked right past me, and turned her attention back to her paperwork. We pushed through those heavy double doors at the end of the hallway, leaving the intensive care unit behind. We moved quickly down the silent, empty corridors, navigating the maze of the hospital until we reached the large metal doors of the service elevator. Dexter swiped a stolen keycard and the doors slid open. The elevator took us all the way down to the sub-basement. The air down there was thick and humid, smelling strongly of industrial detergent and exhaust fumes. We walked past the massive laundry machines and pushed open the heavy steel doors of the loading dock. The freezing night air of Detroit hit me like a physical blow, slapping the remaining grogginess completely out of my system. It was pitch black outside. The city was asleep. Dexter led me across the empty concrete lot, keeping to the dark shadows cast by the massive garbage dumpsters. A rusty dark blue van was parked near the chain-link fence. It was an old commercial plumbing vehicle with faded lettering on the side. Dexter unlocked the back doors and we climbed inside the windowless cargo hold. He pulled the doors shut behind us, plunging us into total darkness before clicking on a small battery-powered lantern. The inside of the van smelled like stale coffee, old cigarette smoke, and heavy motor oil. It reminded me of my old garage. Dexter reached under a pile of moving blankets and pulled out a heavy canvas duffel bag. He dropped it onto the metal floor with a loud, heavy thud. He unzipped the bag and the dim light illuminated our arsenal. There were no shiny laptops inside. There were no fancy hacking gadgets or high-tech espionage tools. The bag was filled with heavy-duty bolt cutters, industrial wire strippers, a portable thermal drill, and a set of professional lockpicks. This was old-school gear. This was the equipment we used back in the 70s, when problems could not be solved from behind a keyboard. When a door was locked, you did not write a line of code to open it. You broke the hinges. Todd Vance thinks his $50 million security system makes him a god, Dexter said, pulling a matte black pistol from a hidden compartment in the bag. He racked the slide, checking the chamber before slipping the weapon into a leather shoulder holster. He has biometric scanners, retina readers, and pressure-sensitive floors covering every inch of that corporate tower. The cybersecurity division is monitored 24 hours a day. I reached into the bag and pulled out a heavy iron crowbar. The cold metal felt familiar and grounding in my calloused hands. Todd thinks a computer is going to save him, I said, my voice a low, steady rumble in the dark van. But a computer is just a machine built by men. It needs power to run. It needs wires to communicate. I know how machines breathe, Dexter. And I know how to choke them. Dexter pulled out a rolled-up set of blueprints and spread them flat across a wooden crate. He tapped a finger against the detailed schematic of the Vance Global headquarters. We cannot go through the lobby or the parking garage, he explained, tracing a line on the paper. The elevators require active key cards. But the tower was built in the late 90s. It has a massive industrial heating and ventilation system routing through the sub-basement. We are going to access the building through the city steam tunnels. We will climb the primary maintenance shaft all the way to the 45th floor. It was a brutal physical plan. It required climbing dozens of stories in total darkness, carrying heavy equipment while avoiding thermal sensors. With my injured shoulder, it was going to be pure torture. But I did not care. I looked out the small, dirty window in the back of the van. In the distance, rising above the city skyline, was the massive glass and steel tower of Vance Global. The top floors were illuminated, casting a cold, arrogant glow over the streets below. That building was a giant monument built on the bones of my son. Todd was sleeping peacefully in his mansion, entirely unaware that a dead man had just walked out of the hospital. I realized the absolute weight of what we were about to do. If the morning hospital staff realized I was gone, the police would immediately start a citywide search. If I was caught inside that corporate building, I would not just be sent back to the psychiatric ward. Breaking into a billion-dollar tech headquarters and attempting to steal proprietary hardware was a federal crime. Todd would use all of his wealth and influence to ensure I was charged with domestic terrorism or corporate espionage. I would be sentenced to federal prison for the rest of my miserable life. I would die in a cold concrete cell entirely alone. But staying safe meant letting Todd win. It meant letting the men who poisoned my boy walk away with $2 billion in absolute impunity. The audio file Jackson downloaded was corrupted and legally useless without the original hardware to verify it. I needed the physical phone. I needed the silver cell phone sitting on that server rack on the 45th floor. It was the only key left in the world that could unlock the uncorrupted recording of their confession. It was the only way to prove to Jackson and the rest of the world that Todd and Rebecca were cold-blooded murderers. I zipped my dark jacket all the way up to my chin, completely covering the hospital scrubs. I gripped the iron crowbar tightly in my right hand, ready to tear down the empire that stole my family. "Start the engine," I told Dexter, not breaking my gaze from the glowing tower in the distance. "We have a castle to burn down." The dark alleyway behind the Vance Global Tower smelled of rotting garbage and damp concrete. Dexter parked the rusty plumbing van over a heavy iron grate. The engine ticked as it cooled down in the freezing Detroit night. We did not say a word. We both knew the stakes. I reached into the canvas duffel bag and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar. My left shoulder was screaming in absolute agony from the baseball bat hit, but I forced my mind to disconnect from the pain. I was no longer an old man living in a backyard shed. I was a father coming to collect a debt. Dexter handed me a pair of thick rubber gloves. He pulled out a large ring of industrial keys and a portable thermal drill. We stepped out of the van and into the freezing air. Dexter knelt beside the iron grate and used a specialized hook to pull it open. A thick cloud of hot steam immediately billowed up from the subterranean tunnels. This was the city's steam system, a labyrinth of massive pipes and maintenance shafts that ran directly beneath the corporate towers. It was dangerous and highly restricted, but it bypassed every single biometric camera and retina scanner Todd had installed in his $50 million lobby. We climbed down the slippery iron ladder into the absolute darkness. The heat down here was suffocating. It smelled of sulfur and hot metal. Dexter turned on a small red tactical flashlight. The red light would not be picked up by the thermal sensors located higher up in the building. We navigated the maze of massive pipes until we reached a heavy reinforced steel door marked with a yellow warning sign. It was the primary access point for the central heating and ventilation system of the Vance Global Tower. Dexter went to work. He did not use a computer. He used the thermal drill to quietly melt through the heavy deadbolt. It took 10 agonizing minutes. Every second that ticked by felt like an hour. Finally, the lock gave way with a soft click. We pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the main maintenance shaft. Above us was a sheer vertical climb of 45 stories. It was a narrow concrete tube filled with thick electrical cables and air ducts. A simple metal ladder bolted to the wall disappeared upward into the darkness. "We have to climb," Dexter whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "The server room is on the 45th floor. Todd thinks nobody can bypass his elevators. He forgot that every building needs to breathe." I grabbed the first metal rung of the ladder. The cold steel bit into my calloused hands. I pulled my heavy body upward. The pain in my shoulder immediately flared, sending sharp, blinding spikes of agony down my spine. I gritted my teeth, forcing my muscles to work. One rung at a time, one floor at a time. The heat from the steam tunnels slowly faded, replaced by the cold, sterile air conditioning of the corporate floors. 10 floors, 20 floors, 30 floors. My lungs burned. My arms trembled violently. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. But every time I wanted to stop, I thought about the recording. I thought about Rebecca sitting in her perfect kitchen, calmly discussing the amount of poison needed to stop my son's heart. That memory was fuel. It burned hotter than any muscle pain. When we finally reached the 45th floor, my hands were bleeding. We dragged ourselves onto a small metal grating inside the ventilation shaft. Dexter carefully unscrewed the metal vent cover and peered out into the hallway. "The corridor is clear," he whispered, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "But look at the door at the end of the hall." I shifted my weight and looked through the slats of the vent. The door to the private server room was massive. It was made of solid reinforced steel. Above the door was a sleek black camera, a biometric fingerprint scanner, and a digital keypad. "If we step out of this vent, that camera will flag our faces instantly," Dexter explained. "If we try to tamper with the biometric scanner, it will trigger a silent alarm and lock down the entire building. There is no physical lock to pick Leon. It is a digital fortress." I stared at the heavy steel door. Todd was a man of the modern age. He trusted algorithms and facial recognition. He trusted code. But I was a man of the physical world. I knew that the biggest machines have the simplest weaknesses. I looked around the narrow maintenance shaft. Running parallel to the ladder were dozens of thick pipes. I traced them with my eyes. 2 of the pipes were heavily insulated, wrapped in thick black foam. They were cold to the touch. They were running directly toward the server room. "Those massive servers generate an incredible amount of heat," I said, keeping my voice to a low rumble. "To keep the motherboards from melting, they need a massive industrial cooling system. Those insulated pipes are carrying liquid freon directly into the server room." Dexter looked at me, his eyes narrowing in the dim red light. "What are you thinking, Leon?" "I am thinking about fire safety protocols," I replied, pulling a massive pair of industrial wire cutters from my tool belt. "If a room filled with electrical equipment suddenly overheats the building, safety protocols will automatically override the security locks. The doors are programmed to slide open to vent the heat and allow emergency crews inside. It is a physical safety mechanism that Todd cannot overwrite with code." "You are going to cut the freon lines?" Dexter asked, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and awe. I wedged myself tightly between the concrete wall and the heavy pipes. I clamped the thick jaws of the wire cutters around the first insulated pipe. I gripped the handles with both hands. I closed my eyes, gathered every ounce of strength left in my battered body, and squeezed with everything I had. The thick metal pipes snapped with a loud, violent hiss. Freezing white gas exploded into the narrow shaft. The temperature plummeted instantly. The smell of chemical coolant filled the air, making us choke and cough. I did not stop. I blindly clamped the cutters around the second pipe and severed it completely. "We cut their lungs out," I whispered, wiping the freezing condensation from my face. "Now we wait for them to choke." We crouched in the dark shaft, watching the heavy steel door through the vent. The tension was agonizing. 1 minute passed, then 2. The silent hallway remained entirely still. Doubt began to creep into the back of my mind. What if Todd had bypassed the fire safety protocols? What if the servers had an internal backup cooling system? But then the overhead lights in the hallway suddenly shifted from a bright, sterile white to a deep, pulsing red. A soft electronic chime echoed through the corridor. It was not a security alarm. It was an environmental warning. The heavy steel door of the server room let out a loud hydraulic hiss. The mechanical locks disengaged. Slowly, the massive door slid open, completely automatically venting the rapidly rising heat from the room. "I did it!" I breathed, pushing the vent cover open and stepping out into the red-lit hallway. "I will watch the corridor," Dexter said, pulling his black pistol from his shoulder holster. "You have exactly 2 minutes before the automated system alerts the building manager about the temperature spike. Get the phone, Leon." I walked into the server room. The noise was deafening. Dozens of massive black server racks hummed and vibrated furiously. The cooling fans were spinning at maximum speed, desperately trying to compensate for the severed Freon lines. The room felt like an oven. I moved quickly down the narrow aisles of blinking lights and tangled wires. I reached the very last rack in the darkest corner of the room, and there it was. Sitting on a cold metal shelf wired into a massive, bulky decryption machine was a simple silver cell phone. It was Kendrick's phone, the same phone I had placed in his suit pocket 15 years ago. It was battered and scratched, but the screen was glowing faintly, displaying an endless stream of complex algorithms as Todd's machine tried to forcefully crack the passcode. My hands trembled violently as I reached out and touched the cold silver casing. I felt a crushing wave of sorrow and an absolute burning rage. They had dug him up. They had violated his grave just to steal his genius. I grabbed the phone. I did not care about a delicate disconnection. I yanked the device, violently pulling the thick data cables right out of the decryption machine. The massive computer screen next to it instantly flashed a bright red error message. Decryption failed. Device disconnected. I shoved the silver phone deep into the pocket of my hospital scrubs. I had it. I had the final piece of the puzzle. The uncorrupted audio file was locked inside this physical device. Todd was finished. I turned around ready to run back to the maintenance shaft. But as my boots hit the metal floor, the heavy steel door of the server room suddenly began to slide shut. I froze. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the red emergency lights of the hallway, was a figure. It was not a security guard. It was a young boy wearing an oversized hoodie and carrying a heavy backpack. It was Jackson. He had used Todd's backup security keycard to sneak into the building. He wanted to see the servers for himself. He wanted to know the truth about his father. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice trembling with absolute shock as he saw me standing there in my stolen hospital scrubs. Before I could say a single word, a blinding white spotlight clicked on from the end of the hallway, pinning us both in its harsh glare. The sound of heavy combat boots thundered down the corridor. Todd Vance stepped into the light. He was flanked by 4 massive armed private security contractors. Todd held a heavy black handgun perfectly aimed directly at my chest. "Well, well," Todd said, his voice dripping with pure venomous triumph. "I thought you were dying in a hospital bed, Leon, but here you are, breaking into my building, threatening my son. Looks like I finally have a legal reason to put a bullet in your heart." He pulled back the hammer of the gun. The metallic click echoed louder than the roaring servers. The heavy steel door slid open entirely. I tightened my grip on the heavy iron crowbar, ready to swing at whatever corporate mercenary Todd had sent to stop me. But the silhouette standing in the doorway was too small. The red emergency light from the hallway illuminated a face I never expected to see on the 45th floor of a billionaire tech fortress. It was Jackson. He was wearing a dark, oversized hoodie and carrying his heavy school backpack. His eyes were wide with absolute shock as he looked at me standing there in stolen hospital scrubs, holding a piece of heavy machinery. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice shaking, "you are supposed to be in the hospital. My mom said you had a heart attack. She said you were dying." I lowered the crowbar, my heart shattering at the sight of him. This was the absolute worst place in the world for a 15-year-old boy to be. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" I asked, taking a step toward him. I had to know, he replied, his voice cracking with emotion. I could not sleep at all. I could not stop thinking about that audio file on my computer. The voice that sounded exactly like my real dad. I waited until Mom and Todd fell asleep, and I took Todd's backup master keycard from his home office desk. I took a cab downtown. I needed to see the servers for myself. I needed to know if you were telling the truth. He looked past me, spotting the massive decryption machine and the severed cables hanging from it. Then he looked at the silver cell phone clutched tightly in my hand. He recognized it from the old photographs I used to show him when he was a little boy before Rebecca banned me from talking about Kendrick. You were telling the truth. Jackson breathed a tear rolling down his cheek. They really killed him. I did not have time to comfort him. The automated environmental warning was still chiming and the severed Freon pipes were still hissing behind me, filling the room with chemical fog. We had to get out of this building before the real security forces arrived. Dexter leaned out from the maintenance shaft, his gun drawn. Leon, we have to go right now, Dexter urged. The temperature drop is going to trigger the main alarms any second. I grabbed Jackson's arm gently but firmly. Listen to me, Jackson, I said, keeping my voice low and urgent. I have the proof we need right here in my hand. But we have to leave right now. We are going to climb down the maintenance shaft. It is going to be dark and it is going to be hard, but you have to trust me. I pulled him toward the open ventilation grate. But before we could even take 3 steps, the soft environmental warning chime abruptly stopped. It was instantly replaced by a deafening, high-pitched security siren that rattled my teeth. The red ambient lights vanished. Blinding white strobe lights began flashing violently in the hallway and inside the server room. The digital fortress had finally realized it was under physical attack. They are locking down the building, Jackson yelled over the noise covering his ears. Get in the vent, I ordered, shoving him toward Dexter. Go down the ladder and do not stop until you hit the basement. But it was too late. The heavy thud of combat boots echoed down the corridor, moving with terrifying speed. A massive metal security gate slammed down from the ceiling in the hallway, cutting Dexter off from the server room door. Dexter was trapped in the maintenance shaft on the other side of the thick steel barricade. We were trapped inside the server room. I pulled Jackson behind me, pushing him into the narrow gap between 2 massive server racks. I stepped out into the open aisle, raising my heavy iron crowbar, gripping it with both hands despite the excruciating pain radiating from my crushed shoulder. 4 men wearing black tactical gear burst into the server room. They were not standard security guards. They were highly paid private military contractors. They spread out instantly, raising assault rifles and aiming their laser sights directly at my chest. Drop the weapon, old man, one of the contractors shouted, his voice booming over the blaring siren. I did not drop the crowbar. I stood my ground, shielding the aisle where my grandson was hiding. Then the crowd of armed men parted. 2 more figures walked into the blinding white strobe light of the server room. It was Todd and Rebecca. Todd was wearing a dark designer suit, looking completely out of place in the industrial server room, but his face was twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. Rebecca stood right beside him, wearing a long cashmere coat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. They had been alerted the moment the primary server disconnected. They must have taken a private helicopter from their estate to get here so fast. Well, well, Todd said, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. He stepped past the armed guards, completely confident in his absolute power. I got a notification that my decryption rig went offline. I assumed it was a system error. I never imagined a dead man would walk out of the intensive care unit to come steal from me. Rebecca looked at me with absolute disgust. You are a cockroach, Leon, she spat. We should have let the paramedics sedate you this afternoon. Now you have ruined everything. Do you have any idea how much money is on the line tomorrow morning? You are not getting a single dime of that money, Rebecca. I said, my voice steady and cold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Kendrick's silver cell phone, holding it up for them to see. I have the hardware. The audio file is complete. The whole world is going to hear exactly how you poisoned the father of your child. Todd's eyes locked onto the silver phone. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his face, but he quickly suppressed it, replacing it with a cruel smile. Who do you think is going to listen to you, Leon? Todd mocked, taking another step forward. You are a crazy old man trespassing in a highly secure corporate facility. My men are going to shoot you dead right here on this floor. We will tell the police you were an armed corporate spy. We will take the phone, pry it from your dead hands, and melt it down to slag. You lose, old man. You always lose. He is not crazy. The small, trembling voice echoed from behind me. Jackson slowly stepped out from the shadows of the server racks. He walked to my side, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, facing the people who had raised him. Rebecca's arrogant sneer instantly vanished. The color drained completely from her flawless face. Jackson, she gasped, taking a sudden step forward, her high heels clicking loudly on the metal floor. What are you doing here? How did you get out of the house? I used Todd's master key card. Jackson said, tears streaming down his face, his voice thick with absolute betrayal. I heard the recording, Mom. I heard what you and Todd did to my real dad. Rebecca froze. She looked at Todd, panic finally shattering her cold exterior. Todd, he knows, she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at her own son. Todd did not look at his wife. He looked at Jackson. The billionaire executive realized in a fraction of a second that his entire perfect life, his family, his reputation, and his $2 billion contract were crumbling into dust. The boy was a witness. The boy knew the truth. Jackson could ruin the entire Pentagon deal with one phone call to the authorities. "Come here, Jackson," Rebecca pleaded, reaching her hand out, desperately trying to salvage the illusion. "Come to Mommy. The old man is lying to you. He is manipulating you. Your grandfather is sick in the head. Do not touch me," Jackson screamed, his voice breaking. "You killed him. You killed my dad for money." Jackson grabbed the sleeve of my hospital scrubs, pulling himself closer to me. I wrapped my good arm around his shoulders, holding him tight. I looked right at Rebecca. "You lost him, Rebecca," I said quietly. "You built your life on a graveyard, and now your son knows exactly what kind of monster you really are." Todd let out a slow, heavy sigh. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked around the server room, looking at the flashing strobe lights, the severed cooling pipes, the thick chemical fog, and finally at me and Jackson. "I really tried to do this the easy way," Leon Todd said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "I gave you a place to live. I gave the boy a good life. We could have all been a happy family, but you just could not leave the past in the dirt where it belongs." Todd reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a phone to call the police. He reached past his silk tie and pulled out a heavy black handgun. He gripped the weapon tightly, raising his arm and aiming the barrel directly at my chest. He thumbed the hammer back with a loud metallic click that somehow sounded louder than the blaring security sirens. Todd, no, Rebecca screamed, grabbing his arm. "That is my son. Jackson is standing right there. You cannot do this." Todd violently shoved his wife backward, sending her crashing into a metal server rack. He did not care about Jackson anymore. He did not care about being a father. He only cared about the $2 billion waiting for him at the Pentagon tomorrow. He pointed the gun back at me, his finger tightening on the trigger, ready to execute an old man and a 15-year-old boy to bury his secrets forever. The air inside the server room was thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. Blinding white strobe lights from the security system cut through the shadows, flashing with a violent rhythm. The deafening sound of the alarms made it impossible to think clearly. Todd stood just a few feet away with his heavy black handgun aimed directly at my heart. His hand was completely steady. He looked at me with the cold, empty eyes of a man who had already committed murder once and was perfectly willing to do it again to protect his wealth. Rebecca stepped out from behind him. The flawless designer coat she wore could not hide the absolute monster hiding underneath her skin. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. The terrifying reality of losing her perfect life and her $2 billion fortune had completely shattered her carefully constructed facade of a loving mother and a grieving widow. "Shoot the old bastard," she screamed at Todd and the armed guards. Her voice was sharp and desperate, carrying over the blaring security sirens. "Kill him right now, Todd. Just put a bullet in his head. We will tell the police he was an armed intruder. We will tell them he attacked us first with that crowbar. Nobody is ever going to believe a crazy old man who lives in a backyard shed. He is a trespasser. Shoot him and let us be done with this nightmare." Her words were pure, unfiltered poison. She spoke with such casual cruelty, completely ready to watch her former father-in-law die on the cold metal floor. She thought she was safe. She thought her teenage son was fast asleep in his warm bed miles away in their gated mansion. She had absolutely no idea that Jackson was standing right behind me, hidden in the dark, narrow space between the massive computer servers. The boy had heard every single word. "What did you just say?" Jackson's voice was small and trembling, but it cut through the chaotic noise of the room like a shockwave. He stepped slowly out of the dark shadows. His oversized hoodie hung loosely on his thin frame. His face was pale white, and his cheeks were soaked with tears. He looked like a ghost standing in the flashing white light. He stared at his mother with absolute terror and devastation. "You want him to shoot my grandfather?" Jackson asked, his voice cracking, breaking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. Rebecca froze completely. The angry color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Her mouth dropped open as she stared at her son. The mask of the perfect, loving mother did not just slip, it shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. She took a clumsy, unsteady step forward, her hands shaking violently. "Jackson," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at home. You are supposed to be in your room." She reached her hand out toward him, desperately trying to pull him back into her web of lies. "I thought he was a thief, Jackson," she lied, trying to force a reassuring smile that looked completely insane on her terrified face. "I did not know it was your grandfather. It is dark in here and I was scared. You have to understand that Mommy was just scared." But it was too late for lies. The illusion was dead. Jackson took a step back, moving closer to me, pulling away from the woman who had brought him into the world. "I heard the recording," Mom Jackson said, openly weeping now. "I heard what you and Todd did to my real dad. I heard you talking about the poison. I know you killed him for the money." Rebecca let out a strangled, sobbing gasp. She looked at Todd, begging him silently to fix the situation, to use his power and his money to make the truth go away. But Todd did not care about his wife's broken heart. Todd was a predator. He realized in a fraction of a second that his stepson was no longer a child to be manipulated. Jackson was a witness. Jackson knew the truth about the murder and the stolen patent. Jackson was a direct threat to the $2 billion defense contract with the government. Todd looked at the crying boy and his eyes remained entirely empty. He did not lower the weapon. He shifted his stance slightly, aiming the barrel of the gun to cover both me and my grandson. "I really tried to give you a good life, kid," Todd said, his voice completely devoid of any human emotion. "But we have to protect the company. Sometimes you have to reboot the system to fix a fatal error." Todd tightened his finger on the trigger. The armed mercenaries behind him raised their assault rifles, ready to follow their employer's lead. I did not drop to my knees. I did not beg for mercy. I am an old mechanic from the streets of Detroit, and I do not surrender to cowards in expensive suits. My left hand was still buried deep in the pocket of my hospital scrubs, tightly gripping Kendrick's silver cell phone. Over the last 15 years, I had learned one very important lesson about these massive billion-dollar computer systems. They are incredibly powerful, but they have no soul. They are completely blind. They just follow the emergency protocols programmed into their core architecture. I pulled the silver phone from my pocket. I slid my rough thumb across the cracked glass screen. I did not need to hack into Todd's network. I did not need to write a virus. I just needed to trigger the emergency environmental failsafe that Jackson had accidentally uncovered during his network sweep the day before. It was a backdoor command tied to the physical hardware of the servers. It was designed to save the machines from a catastrophic fire. I looked Todd dead in the eye and I pressed the execute sequence on the screen. A massive mechanical groan echoed from the ceiling above us, vibrating through the soles of my boots. The heavy steel vents of the server room blew open with a deafening explosive blast. It was not water. It was halon gas. Thick white chemical vapor poured down into the room like a violent waterfall. Halon gas is an industrial fire suppression agent designed to instantly suck the oxygen out of the air to smother an electrical fire. Within a single second, the entire server room went completely blind. The flashing white strobe lights were swallowed by the impenetrable thick white fog. Todd panicked and pulled the trigger. The gunshot roared in the confined space, but the sudden explosive blast of the gas had ruined his aim. The bullet flew past my ear and shattered a glass server panel behind me, sending a shower of sparks flying into the mist. The sparks died instantly in the oxygen-starved air. Todd and his armed guards began coughing violently. The gas burned their throats and blinded their eyes. I heard the heavy clatter of rifles hitting the metal floor as the mercenaries dropped their weapons to cover their faces, stumbling blindly in the dark. Rebecca was screaming in absolute terror, somewhere in the thick fog, coughing and choking as she crashed into a metal rack. I grabbed the collar of Jackson's jacket. I pulled him down hard, forcing him to his knees. "Stay low," I shouted over the roaring hiss of the gas. "The halon is lighter than air. We have to crawl." We dragged ourselves across the freezing metal floor, keeping our faces inches from the ground where a thin layer of breathable oxygen still remained. My injured shoulders screamed in agony with every movement, but I pushed the pain away. I guided Jackson through the maze of screaming servers, listening to the chaotic sounds of our enemies choking and stumbling behind us. We reached the back wall. My hand found the open metal grate of the ventilation shaft. Dexter was waiting on the other side, wearing a heavy respirator mask. He reached down and grabbed Jackson's jacket, pulling the boy up into the narrow maintenance tunnel. I grabbed the edge of the grate and hauled my heavy body up into the shaft. Dexter slammed the heavy metal cover shut behind us, twisting the latch to lock it in place. The roaring sound of the server room was instantly muffled. We did not stop to rest. We climbed down the dark, vertical ladder, dropping floor by floor into the hot, humid depths of the city steam tunnels. We navigated the dark maze of pipes until we reached the rusty iron grate leading back to the alleyway. Dexter pushed the grate open and we climbed out into the freezing night air of Detroit. The city was completely silent and unaware of the war that had just been fought in the sky above them. I pulled Jackson close, wrapping my good arm around him as he sobbed quietly against my chest. We had escaped the fortress. We left Todd and Rebecca suffocating in the ruins of their crumbling empire. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold silver metal of my son's phone. The truth was finally safe. Tomorrow, the whole world would hear it. 3 days passed. 3 days of absolute silence. For 3 days, Todd Vance lived in a state of quiet terror, masked by his extreme wealth. He unleashed every single resource he had to find us. He hired the most expensive private security contractors in the country. He told them I was a dangerous corporate terrorist who had kidnapped his stepson. He ordered his mercenaries to search every homeless shelter, every hospital, and every bus station in the city. He paid off local politicians to keep the police moving quietly. He wanted me found and eliminated before the sun rose on the day of the ceremony. He assumed an old man with a crushed shoulder could not survive on the freezing streets of Detroit. He assumed I would make a fatal mistake and use a credit card or a public telephone. He forgot that I was a man who knew how to live entirely off the grid. Dexter and I did not run. We hid in plain sight. We stayed in the flooded basement of an abandoned auto repair shop on the edge of the industrial district. Down there in the damp dark, we set up a secure offline terminal. We connected Kendrick's silver phone to the computer. Todd thought the phone was useless without his massive decryption servers. He was completely wrong. The phone was never designed to keep me out. It was designed to wait for me. The decryption process did not require brute force or complex algorithms. It required a father's love. Kendrick had built a backdoor into the operating system. The password was not a random string of numbers. It was the exact geographic coordinate of the public park where I taught him how to ride a bicycle. When I typed those numbers into the terminal, the heavy digital locks simply vanished. The uncorrupted audio file loaded onto the screen. We pressed play. The voice of my dead son filled the dark basement. It was a recording he made just minutes before they killed him. He had realized the drink was poisoned. He had realized his own wife was the one who handed it to him. His final words were not a plea for his life. They were a message to me telling me the absolute truth. The audio contained the crystal-clear voices of Todd and Rebecca discussing the dosage of the poison and planning the fake car crash. Jackson sat in the corner of that cold basement listening to his mother's voice, ordering the execution of his real father. The boy did not cry anymore. The tears were completely gone. They were replaced by a cold, hard understanding of the world. The boy who loved video games died in that basement. A young man with eyes like steel took his place. By the morning of the 3rd day, Todd convinced himself that he had won. He believed that the old man had crawled away to die from his injuries. He believed the halon gas had destroyed my lungs. Arrogance is the greatest weakness of a billionaire. Todd put on his custom-tailored suit and looked in the mirror, seeing a god among men. He and Rebecca flew to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for the signing ceremony. The Waldorf Astoria was a fortress of gold and marble. The grand ballroom was packed with the most powerful people in the United States. Men in expensive suits and women wearing diamonds sat in velvet chairs. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with caviar and crystal glasses filled with vintage champagne. Huge crystal chandeliers hung from the gold-painted ceilings, casting a warm, luxurious glow over the room. The elite architects of the country were all gathered in one place. High-ranking military generals in their decorated uniforms sat in the front row. Powerful senators and government officials mingled with corporate executives. The National Press Corps had set up a massive wall of cameras at the back of the room ready to broadcast the historic $2 billion defense contract to the entire world. Rebecca sat in the front row wearing a stunning white designer dress. She smiled for the cameras, playing the role of the proud, supportive wife flawlessly. She told the reporters that her son Jackson was simply home with a minor flu. She showed absolutely no remorse for the horrors she had committed. She was completely intoxicated by the smell of money and the illusion of absolute security. She thought the heavy oak doors of the ballroom would protect her from the ghosts of her past. Todd walked out onto the brightly lit stage. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. He stepped up to the heavy wooden podium and looked down at the sea of powerful faces. He smiled the smile of a predator who had successfully devoured his prey and gotten away with it. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak. He started his speech with a practiced lie. He talked about the future, he talked about innovation and national security. He talked about the countless sleepless nights he supposedly spent developing the artificial intelligence. He talked about his vision for a safer world. He looked directly into the camera lenses of the national news networks and lied to the entire country. He stole my son's legacy and paraded it in front of the world as his own crowning achievement. He played the role of the visionary genius perfectly. I stood in the hidden sound control booth overlooking the entire ballroom. Dexter had secured our access by disabling the hotel security feed and quietly replacing the audio technicians before the event began. I looked down through the tinted glass window at the brightly lit stage. My injured shoulder throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but I did not feel it anymore. I watched Todd finishing his speech. A high-ranking general walked onto the stage carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was the official government contract bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. The general shook Todd's hand and placed the massive document on the table next to the podium. He reached into his pocket and handed Todd a heavy, gold-plated pen. The cameras began to flash rapidly, filling the room with bursts of blinding white light. The entire ballroom fell into a deep, respectful silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of the camera shutters capturing the historic moment. Todd looked out at the crowd one last time, soaking in the absolute adoration of the world. He looked down at Rebecca and gave her a small, arrogant nod. He turned his attention to the signature line on the final page of the contract. He leaned forward, bringing the gold pen down toward the heavy white paper. He was one signature away from $2 billion. He was 1 second away from total victory. But as the metal tip of the pen touched the paper, I pressed a single button on the audio mixing console. The massive speakers surrounding the elegant ballroom violently erupted. A piercing, deafening screech of digital feedback tore through the silence, ripping the perfect illusion into a million jagged pieces. The piercing screech of digital feedback ripped through the elegant ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. Todd dropped the heavy gold pen. He covered his ears and stumbled backward away from the wooden podium. The generals and senators in the front row flinched. The absolute silence of the room was entirely shattered. Behind Todd, the massive high-definition screens displaying the Vance Global logo began to violently glitch. The pristine blue and white corporate colors distorted into jagged lines of static. Then the screens went pitch black. A single bright green audio waveform appeared in the center of the darkness, pulsing like a heartbeat. I pushed the master volume slider on the mixing console all the way up. The voice of my dead son echoed across the ballroom. It was clear and undeniable. He sounded breathless and terrified. He was saying it is in the code they do not know about the failsafe. Then the voices shifted. The green waveform spiked violently as Todd's voice filled the room. He sounded panicked, completely different from the smooth billionaire who was just giving a speech. He said, "The steering column is rigged. Are you absolutely sure the dosage was high enough, Rebecca?" The entire ballroom froze. Every single eye turned to Rebecca, sitting in the front row. Her voice echoed from the massive speakers, dripping with cold, calculated venom. She said it was enough thallium to stop a horse's heart. Todd just push his body behind the wheel and pour the whiskey all over his clothes. The police will smell the cheap alcohol before they even bother to check his pulse. We have to make it look like he was drunk. The horrifying sound of crunching metal and shattering glass blasted through the room. It was the sound of my son's life ending. It was the sound of their $2 billion empire being born. For 5 agonizing seconds, there was absolute dead silence in the ballroom. No one breathed. The generals stared at the stage in pure shock. The senators looked at each other in horror. Then the room exploded. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. The National Press Corps at the back of the room went absolutely feral. Dozens of reporters began shouting questions all at once, pushing past the security barricades. The bright white flashes of camera lenses fired like machine guns, capturing the raw terror on Todd's face. The high-ranking military generals immediately stepped away from the table, leaving the $2 billion contract sitting untouched. They looked at Todd with absolute disgust. Security personnel began speaking frantically into their wrist radios, completely unsure of what to do. The most powerful people in the country were scrambling toward the exits, trying to distance themselves from a man who had just confessed to murder on national television. Todd grabbed the microphone on the podium. His face was pale white and slick with heavy sweat. He pointed a shaking finger at the green waveform on the screen. "It is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his panic. "It is a fabrication. Turn it off right now. It is an artificial intelligence deepfake created by a corporate rival to ruin this contract. Do not listen to it. Arrest the sound technicians." Rebecca tried to stand up, but her legs completely gave out. She collapsed back into her velvet chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The elegant white designer dress she wore suddenly looked like a funeral shroud. The cameras zeroed in on her, broadcasting her devastating guilt to millions of people watching live across the country. She looked around the room searching for a friendly face, but she found absolutely nothing but judgment and disgust. I stood in the dark sound booth looking down at the total destruction of my enemies. I felt no joy. I only felt the cold, heavy weight of justice finally settling over the room. I reached over and locked the heavy metal door of the sound booth from the inside, ensuring that the audio would loop continuously until someone physically broke the door down. I turned to Dexter and nodded. It was time. We left the booth through a secondary maintenance stairwell. My heavy boots echoed on the concrete steps. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had just won a war that lasted 15 years. I walked down to the main floor of the hotel, stepping out into the grand lobby. Inside the ballroom, Todd was still screaming desperately, trying to convince the generals that he was a victim of a massive conspiracy. He begged them to sign the paper. He ordered his private security guards to find whoever was playing the audio. The noise inside the room was deafening. But then, the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom slowly swung open. The bright, warm light from the lobby spilled into the chaotic room. I stepped through the doorway. I did not run. I did not hide. I walked right down the center aisle of the ballroom wearing my old canvas work jacket. I stood tall, ignoring the pain in my shoulder. The sea of reporters and politicians slowly parted for me. The flashing cameras turned away from the stage and focused entirely on the old black mechanic from Detroit. I walked straight toward the podium, looking directly into the terrified eyes of Todd Vance. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. The flashing cameras turned away from the stage and focused entirely on me. I was not wearing a tailored suit. I was wearing my heavy canvas work jacket and my old boots. But I was not walking alone. Behind me walked 4 federal agents wearing dark suits and heavy tactical vests. The bold yellow letters on their chests identified them as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission walked right beside them, carrying heavy black briefcases. The entire room parted for us like the Red Sea. Todd stood completely frozen behind the wooden podium. His perfect hair was ruined. His expensive tie was crooked. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a cage made of his own lies. He opened his mouth to speak, to command his security to stop me, but no words came out. His private mercenaries saw the federal agents and immediately backed away, lowering their weapons and raising their hands. They were paid to protect a billionaire, not to fight the United States government. I did not look at Todd. I walked straight past the podium and approached the high-ranking military general sitting at the front table. The general was standing now, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and deep respect. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out a single yellow manila folder. It was the same type of folder Todd had tried to use against me with the police just 3 days ago. I handed it directly to the general. I kept my voice low and steady, carrying the weight of 15 years of silent suffering. I told the general to read the documents inside that folder before he signed anything. I told him that the man standing on the stage did not own the compression algorithm. Todd Vance never owned the patent. My son Kendrick was a genius who knew he was being hunted by the people closest to him. Kendrick knew Todd and Rebecca were planning to kill him for his work. Fearing for his life, he did not leave the intellectual property in his own name. He secretly transferred the entire algorithm and all associated patents into a blind trust 15 years ago. The general opened the folder and his eyes scanned the heavy legal documents. The seals were authentic. The signatures were verified by the federal government. I told the room that Kendrick appointed only one person as the sole executor of that blind trust, me, Leon Carter. I told them that the technology they were about to buy for $2 billion belonged entirely to an old mechanic from Detroit. One of the agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission stepped forward. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of financial records. He spoke with absolute clinical precision. He announced that every single document Todd Vance had signed over the last 15 years was completely fraudulent. Every company asset he claimed, every stock he sold, and every contract he negotiated was built on a massive lie. The agent stated that Todd was officially under investigation for federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and massive tax evasion. The penalty for defrauding the federal government on a defense contract was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The lead agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped up onto the stage. He did not ask Todd to turn around. He grabbed Todd by the shoulder of his expensive suit and violently spun him around. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He announced that Todd and Rebecca were both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. The audio file playing on the loop in the ballroom was already in the hands of the district attorney. I turned around and looked at Rebecca. She was still sitting in her velvet chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her destruction. Two female federal agents approached her and pulled her roughly to her feet. The elegant white designer dress dragged on the floor as they locked the cold steel cuffs around her wrists. She looked at me, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. She finally realized that the old man she had thrown into a backyard shed had just dismantled her entire reality brick by brick. Todd and Rebecca were stripped of everything in a matter of seconds. Their bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government. Their massive estate was seized as evidence of corporate fraud. They did not own the algorithm. They did not own the company. They did not even own the clothes on their backs. They had spent 15 years building a kingdom of glass, and I had just thrown the final stone. They owned absolutely nothing. They were absolutely nothing. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around Todd's wrists with a loud, sharp sound that echoed across the silent stage. The billionaire tech genius who had just stood at the podium like a god was completely gone. In his place was a broken, blubbering mess of a man. Todd fell to his knees, weeping openly. He begged the federal agents to listen to him. He offered them money. He offered them stock options. He babbled incoherently about how he was set up. The lead agent did not even look at him. He simply read Todd his rights in a flat, monotone voice, dragging him up from the floor by the collar of his ruined designer suit. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the stage and looked down at Rebecca. She was kneeling on the carpeted floor of the grand ballroom. The elegant white designer dress she wore was wrinkled and stained. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess. Two female agents stood directly behind her, waiting for the order to pull her up. She looked up at me, and the mask of the cold, calculating murderer was completely gone. She looked like a terrified animal caught in a trap she had set herself. She reached out and grabbed the fabric of my canvas jacket. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Leon, please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperate panic. "You cannot do this to me. I am a mother. Please have mercy on me. Do it for Jackson's sake. He needs his mother. You cannot take his mother away from him." I looked down at the woman who had poisoned my son. I looked at the woman who had thrown me into a freezing shed and tried to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. I felt absolutely no anger toward her anymore. The burning rage that had kept me alive for the last 15 years was completely extinguished. I only felt a cold, absolute emptiness when I looked at her. I gently pulled my jacket out of her desperate grip. I did not raise my voice. I spoke to her with the pure, icy calm of a man who had finally finished a very long job. "State prison is not so bad, Rebecca," I said, looking directly into her terrified eyes. "At least they have a television in the cell, just like you promised me." She gasped as if I had physically struck her. The words hit her with the crushing weight of absolute reality. She realized that I had remembered every single cruel thing she had ever said to me. She realized that there was absolutely no mercy left in the world for her. She buried her face in her trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The two female agents stepped forward, grabbed her by the arms, and hauled her up from the floor. They marched her away toward the heavy oak doors, leading her out of the ballroom and out of my life forever. I stood alone in the center of the room. The flashing cameras had finally stopped. The politicians and the generals were quietly packing up their briefcases and leaving the ballroom, eager to distance themselves from the massive scandal. The $2 billion contract remained unsigned, sitting on the stage, completely worthless. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom. I walked through the grand lobby of the hotel, leaving the marble pillars and the crystal chandeliers behind me. Dexter was waiting for me near the main entrance. Standing right beside him was my grandson. Jackson looked up at me as I approached. He had watched his mother and his stepfather get taken away in handcuffs. It was a heavy, terrible burden for a 15-year-old boy to carry. But he did not look broken. He looked relieved. The dark, heavy cloud of lies that had suffocated him his entire life was finally gone. I placed my good hand on his shoulder. "It is over," I told him. "We are going home." Jackson nodded and wiped his eyes. He leaned against my side, resting his head against my arm. We walked past the revolving glass doors of the hotel and stepped out into the streets of the city. The legal fallout lasted for months. Todd and Rebecca were denied bail and sent directly to federal prison to await trial for murder and corporate fraud. The massive tech empire they had built was completely dismantled by the government. But the core algorithm, the revolutionary data compression code that Kendrick had built, belonged entirely to the Carter Family Trust. The $2 billion from the government contract was processed legally and transferred directly into the trust account. It was blood money, but it was going to be used to build a secure future for the boy Kendrick had left behind. I never bought a gun, I never raised my fists. I was just an old mechanic from Detroit. But I understood how the world worked. Todd and Rebecca believed that their money and their arrogance made them completely untouchable. They believed they could crush anyone who got in their way. I did not fight them with violence. I used their own massive, blinding greed against them. I let them build a perfect, beautiful glass castle right on top of a legal landmine, and then I simply walked in and triggered the detonator. The bright morning sunlight hit my face as I walked down the busy sidewalk with my grandson. The air felt incredibly clean. I looked up at the clear blue sky and thought about my son. The debt was finally paid. The dirt on his grave could finally settle in peace. I was 75 years old, but as I walked into the sunlight with Jackson by my side, I felt like my life was just beginning. The greatest lesson I took from all of this is that arrogance is a blinding disease. People who build their empires on lies and innocent blood always believe their money makes them untouchable. They look down on the quiet ones. They look down on the old and the humble. But true power never needs to scream. It operates in absolute silence. It gathers evidence. It waits for the perfect moment to strike. I learned that you never have to destroy yourself to defeat a monster. You just have to let their own blinding greed dig their graves for them. If this story of silent justice resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people in your own life.